Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Eugene Blackthorne, but folks around here just call me Gene. I've been a park ranger for 15 years now, working the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. It's beautiful country, but it's got secrets buried deep in these mountains that most people don't want to know about. I wasn't always a ranger. My daddy and his daddy before him worked coal mines their whole lives. 3 generations of Blackthorns pulling black gold from these hills. I was supposed to follow that path too, until the day everything changed. I was 23 when the mine collapsed. Daddy was down there with 12 other men when the ceiling came down. They never found the bodies. The company said it was too dangerous to dig them out, sealed the whole thing up with concrete. Mama got a check for $2,000 and a letter saying they were sorry for our loss. That's when I decided I was done with coal. I wanted to protect these mountains instead of tearing them apart. Took me years to get my ranger certification, but I made it. Now I know every abandoned mine shaft and forgotten hollow in 200 square miles of forest. Most of them are dangerous as hell, but that's my job, keeping people safe from places that want to kill them. October 1976 was when everything went wrong. The leaves were just starting to turn, and we'd had our first snow already. Cold came early that year, dropping down to 20 degrees at night. The fog would roll into the valleys so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. That's when the reports started coming in. Hunters said they heard pickaxes ringing through the mountains at night. Old-timers talked about lights moving underground, glowing through cracks in the rock. Most folks figured it was just stories. Mountain people love their ghost tales. But then I started finding dead canaries. See, some of the old mine entrances still had cages hanging near them. Canaries were used to test for bad air back in the day. These birds had been dead for years, but they should have been just bones by now. Instead, I kept finding fresh bodies. No wounds, no signs of sickness. They just looked like they'd laid down and died. That should have been my first warning. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 3 college kids had gone missing up on Pine Mountain. Urban explorers, they called themselves. Kids with cameras and laptops who thought abandoned mines were cool places to take pictures. Found their car at the trailhead, Sheriff Morton told me over the radio. Been there 3 days. No sign of the kids. I knew Pine Mountain. It was honeycombed with old coal mines from the 1920s. Dangerous place even in daylight. At night, with the fog rolling in, it was a death trap. I'll head up there, I said. Probably fell down a shaft or got lost in the tunnels. Be careful, Gene. Something feels wrong about this one. Sheriff Morton was right. Something did feel wrong. I just didn't know how wrong until it was too late. I drove up to Pine Mountain as the sun was setting. The kid's car was still there, a beat-up Honda with college stickers all over the back window. I checked inside and found maps of the mine system, cameras, and notebooks full of research about the 1943 cave-in. 47 miners died in that collapse. Never found the bodies. Just like Daddy. I followed their trail up the mountain. It led straight to the old Blue Diamond mine entrance. The shaft had been sealed back in 1965, but the steel grate looked different. It was pushed aside, bent outward like something had forced it open from the inside. That was impossible. The grate weighed over 200 pounds, and there was nothing behind it but collapsed rock and concrete. But there it was, hanging open like a mouth full of broken teeth. I clicked on my flashlight and looked inside. The beam cut through darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The air smelled wrong. Not just old and stale, but metallic, like blood mixed with coal dust. And there, 20 feet inside the tunnel, I saw a backpack. I should have waited for backup. That's what the manual says. Never enter a dangerous area alone. But those kids might be hurt. Maybe dying while I stood around following rules. I checked my gear. Rope, gas detector, extra batteries, emergency beacon. My radio crackled with static as I stepped into the mine. By the time I was 50 feet in, it was completely dead. The tunnel was bigger than I expected. The cave-in was supposed to have blocked everything, but there was a clear path deeper into the mountain. My boots crunched on coal dust that looked fresh, even though this mine had been closed for over 10 years. That's when I saw the footprints. 3 sets, just like the missing kids. But they weren't heading out. They went deeper, following the main tunnel toward the heart of Pine Mountain. I followed them, my flashlight beam dancing over wooden support beams that were older than my grandfather. The temperature should have stayed around 55 degrees. Mines are always the same temperature year-round. But the deeper I went, the warmer it got. By the time I'd walked for 20 minutes, I was sweating inside my jacket. Then I heard the sound. Ring, ring, ring. Someone was swinging a pickaxe against rock, keeping perfect time like a clock. The sound echoed through the tunnels, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" I called out. "Park service? Anyone down here?" The ringing stopped. Silence pressed against my ears like deep water. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, it started again. Ring, ring, ring. Same rhythm, same endless beat. I kept following the footprints. They led me through a maze of passages, some so narrow I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The wooden support beams were carved with names and dates going back to the 1920s, but some of the carvings looked fresh, like they'd been made yesterday. That's when I saw the first one. It was just a glimpse caught in the edge of my flashlight beam, a figure in the side passage, swinging a pickaxe. When I turned the light directly toward it, nothing was there, just empty tunnel and settling dust. I told myself it was shadows playing tricks. Mines do that to your eyes after a while. But I knew what I'd seen. A man in old work clothes, bent over like he'd been digging for hours. My gas detector started beeping. Not the danger signal, just the normal reading. But the air tasted like metal pennies, and it burned my throat when I breathed deep. I checked my watch. I'd been underground for 3 hours, but it felt like 20 minutes. Time moves funny in the dark, but not that funny. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, big enough to stand up straight. My light caught something glinting in the corner. I walked over and found a pile of mining equipment, pickaxes, shovels, hard hats with carbide lamps. The metal was clean, no rust at all. One of the pickaxe handles was still warm. "This is impossible," I whispered. That's when I heard the voices. They were singing an old mining song, something about going down in the dark and never coming back up. The words echoed through the tunnels, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from. It sounded like dozens of men, all singing together. I followed the sound deeper into the mine. The singing got louder, and I started to make out individual voices. Old voices, rough from years of breathing coal dust. They were singing about their families, about the money they'd send home, about the work that never ended. The tunnel curved to the right, and I saw light ahead. Not electric light, the warm, flickering glow of carbide lamps. I turned off my flashlight and crept forward. The passage opened into a huge chamber, bigger than a church, and it was full of miners. And they stood in groups, swinging their tools against the walls, loading coal into carts that had no wheels. Their movements were slow and steady, like they'd been doing the same job for 50 years. The carbide lamps on their helmets cast dancing shadows on the walls. None of them looked up when I entered the chamber. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, watching them work. They moved like they were underwater, every action taking just a little too long. The sound of their tools echoed through the space. Ring, 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 the same rhythm I'd been hearing. That's when I realized something was wrong with their faces. Where their eyes should have been, there were just empty holes, dark sockets that seemed to go back forever into their skulls. But deep inside each socket, something glowed like embers in a dying fire. And they weren't breathing. I stepped backward, trying to get out of the chamber without making noise, but my boot kicked a loose rock. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Every single miner stopped working. Slowly, they turned to look at me. 40 or 50 hollow faces, all staring with those burning ember eyes. One of them opened his mouth and spoke in a voice like wind through broken glass. "New worker," he said. "Come to join the crew." That's when I ran. I ran through those tunnels like the devil himself was chasing me. Maybe he was. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I stumbled over loose rocks and ducked under low beams. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Not footsteps. They didn't make footsteps. It was more like a rushing wind or water flowing through stone. And that voice, echoing from every direction. "Come back, worker. The shift's not over." I tried to remember the way out, but the tunnels had changed. Passages I'd walked through an hour ago were gone. New ones opened where solid rock had been before. It was like the mountain was alive, rearranging itself to keep me trapped. My radio was still dead, but I tried the emergency beacon anyway. The little red light blinked once and went dark. Even the technology was giving up. Down here. I turned a corner and almost ran into one of them. It was standing right in the middle of the tunnel, pickaxe raised like it was about to swing. Up close, I could see it wasn't really solid. The edges of its body faded into the darkness like smoke. But those ember eyes were real enough, and they were looking right at me. "Your daddy's waiting," it said in that wind-glass voice. "Down in the deep places. Been waiting 30 years for you to come home." I swung my flashlight like a club, but it passed right through the thing. The miner laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a well, and dissolved into coal dust. The dust swirled around me, getting in my eyes and mouth. For a second I couldn't see anything. When it cleared, there were 3 of them blocking the tunnel. I turned and ran the other way. The temperature was getting hotter. My jacket was soaked with sweat, and the air was so thick I could barely breathe. The wooden support beams were starting to sag, like the weight of the mountain was pressing down. That's when I found the college kids. They were in a side chamber, sitting against the wall with their cameras and notebooks scattered around them. At first I thought they were dead. Then one of them looked up at me. "Ranger?" she said. Her voice sounded far away, like she was talking through water. "We've been waiting for you." Something was wrong with her eyes. They were starting to go dark around the edges, like someone was slowly turning off a light behind them. The other 2 kids looked the same way, partly there, partly not. "We found them," the girl said. "The miners. They told us about the work, how it never ends, how there's always more coal to dig." "We have to get out of here," I said, grabbing her arm. It felt cold, like she'd been sitting in snow for hours. She shook her head. "Can't leave. Not until the shift is over." The foreman said, "We're part of the crew now." Behind her, one of the boys was picking up a phantom pickaxe. He swung it at the wall, and I heard the ring of metal on stone, even though the tool wasn't really there. The 3rd kid was further gone. His eyes were completely dark now, just empty sockets with tiny flames dancing inside. When he opened his mouth, coal dust spilled out instead of words. "They're changing," I realized. "The hollow men are making them like them." I tried to pull the girl toward the tunnel, but she was heavier than she should have been, like she was part of the mountain itself. And she was getting colder by the minute. "Please," I said. "Your families are worried. They want you to come home." She smiled, and her teeth were black with coal dust. "This is home now, down in the dark where the work never stops." That's when the walls started moving. The coal seam began to crack and split. Hollow men stepped out of the rock itself, emerging from the mountain like they'd been sleeping there for decades. They all looked the same. Empty eyes, tattered work clothes, tools that existed somewhere between real and not real. And they were all walking toward me. "Join the crew," they said in unison, their voices creating a sound like grinding stone. "Your daddy's waiting. Time to go to work." The tunnel behind me filled with more of them. They weren't fast, but they didn't need to be. There was nowhere to run. The mountain itself was their territory, and I was trapped in the middle of it. The girl stood up, moving like her bones had turned to lead. "It doesn't hurt," she said. "After a while, you don't feel anything at all. Just the work, just the rhythm." She picked up a pickaxe that flickered between solid and shadow. When she swung it at the wall, sparks flew from rock that shouldn't have been able to make sparks. Ring, ring, ring. More hollow men emerged from the walls. Some of them looked familiar, faces I'd seen in old photographs, miners who'd died in accidents decades ago. And there, in the back of the group, I saw a face I recognized. It was my father. His ember eyes met mine across the chamber. He opened his mouth, and coal dust fell out like black snow. "Son," he said in a voice that was barely human anymore, "come home." Looking at my father's hollow face, I finally understood what this place really was. It wasn't just a mine. It was a trap, a prison made of stone and sorrow and endless work. "You died 30 years ago," I told him, my voice shaking. "The cave-in took you." He nodded slowly. "Took all of us. But the work don't stop just because you're dead. Coal's still down here. Families still need the money." The other hollow men were getting closer, moving with that underwater slowness. The college kids were changing faster now, their edges going fuzzy like old photographs. Soon they'd be just like the others, empty shells doing empty work for all eternity. "Why?" I asked. "Why can't you rest?" My father stepped forward, his pickaxe dragging on the ground behind him. "Because we never finished the job. 47 men died trying to reach the big seam. Been digging ever since, trying to get to it. But we need help, need fresh workers." I understood now. They weren't evil, just trapped, bound to this place by duty and love and the weight of promises they'd made to families they'd never see again. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. "I won't let you take these kids," I said. "Ain't your choice, son. Mountain decides. Mountain's hungry." The hollow men were close enough to touch now. I could feel the cold radiating from their bodies, see the ember glow of their eyes reflecting off the walls. My breath came out in white puffs, even though it had been boiling hot just minutes before. That's when I remembered the dynamite. Every ranger carries emergency charges for clearing rock slides. I had 3 sticks in my pack, plus electrical caps and wire, enough to bring down a tunnel, maybe even seal this section of the mine permanently. "Daddy," I said, backing toward the wall. "I'm sorry." I pulled out the dynamite and started setting the charges. The hollow men moved faster when they saw what I was doing, but they were still too slow. Ghosts or not, they moved like they had all the time in the world. "You'll trap yourself too," my father said. "Die down here with us." "Maybe, but these kids are going home." I finished wiring the charges and looked at the college students. 2 of them were almost completely gone, their eyes dark holes filled with flickering light. But the girl was still fighting it. She was holding on to her notebook, trying to write something with fingers that kept fading in and out of existence. "Help me," she whispered. "Don't want to stay, don't want to work forever." I grabbed her hand. It was so cold it burned, but I held on tight. "I'm getting you out of here." The hollow men surged forward all at once, moving like a black tide. I triggered the detonator. The explosion was bigger than I expected. The whole chamber shook and chunks of rock rained down from the ceiling. Support beams cracked and splintered. The hollow men scattered like smoke, pulled back into the walls by some force I couldn't understand. "The tunnel!" I shouted to the girl. "Follow the old minecart tracks." We ran through collapsing passages as the mountain shook itself apart around us. Behind us, I could hear my father calling my name, his voice getting fainter as the distance grew. The girl was becoming more solid as we got closer to the surface, like the hold the mine had on her was weakening. By the time we reached the entrance, she looked almost normal again. Almost. We stumbled out into the cold October night just as another section of the mountain collapsed. The entrance to the Blue Diamond mine folded in on itself with a sound like the world ending. I called for emergency medical on my radio, which worked fine now that we were outside. The girl, her name was Sarah, I learned later, was taken to the hospital with severe hypothermia and exhaustion. She recovered completely, but she never talked about what happened down there. The other 2 students were listed as victims of a structural collapse. Their bodies were never recovered because there were no bodies to recover. They were still down there, part of the crew now, swinging phantom pickaxes in the dark. That was 6 months ago. The mine entrance is sealed now, welded shut with steel plates and concrete. The Park Service declared the whole area environmentally hazardous. Official story is that old mining chemicals made the air toxic. They transferred me to surface duties after that. Said I needed time to recover from the trauma. Truth is, I can't handle enclosed spaces anymore. Even walking into a bathroom with the door closed makes me sweat. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the fog rolls into the valleys, I can still hear them down there. The sound of pickaxes ringing against stone, echoing up through cracks in the mountain. The hollow men are still working, still trying to reach that seam of coal that will let them rest. Local families know to stay away from Pine Mountain now. I made sure of that. But every few months, someone reports seeing lights moving underground or hearing voices singing old mining songs. Urban explorers still come around sometimes, drawn by stories on the internet. I run them off when I can. Sarah graduated college and moved to California. She sends me a Christmas card every year, always with the same message: "Thank you for bringing me home." She doesn't remember much about what happened down there, and that's probably for the best. I keep her notebook, though, the one she was holding when I found her. Most of the pages are blank, but on the last page, written in shaky handwriting that gets fainter toward the end, she wrote, "They're not evil. They're just lost. Someone needs to help them find their way home." I think about that, sometimes. About my father and all those other men trapped in the dark for decades, doing work that will never be finished. Maybe someday I'll find a way to help them. Maybe there's a way to break the cycle, to let them finally rest, but not yet. I'm not ready to go back down there, not ready to face those ember eyes again or hear my father's voice calling my name through the darkness. For now, I do my job. I keep people safe from the dangerous places in these mountains. And every night, I listen to the wind in the trees and hope I don't hear the sound of pickaxes ringing in the deep. Because the hollow men of Harlan County are still down there, still working, still waiting for fresh miners to join their crew. And the mountain is always hungry. My name is Frank Mountainheart, and I've been a park ranger for 20 years. Started back in 1943, right after I got home from the war. The Pacific was hell, and when I made it back to Virginia, all I wanted was peace and quiet. The Blue Ridge Parkway gave me that. I patrol a 50-mile stretch of the most beautiful country you ever saw. Rolling green mountains, cool streams, and forests so thick you can walk for hours without seeing another soul. In summer, families come up from the cities to camp and hike. Kids splash in the creeks while their parents sit on blankets and drink coffee from thermos bottles. It's the kind of life that makes you forget there's ugliness in the world. That August of 1963 was hot and sticky, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back even in the shade. But up on the mountain, with the breeze coming through the trees, it wasn't too bad. I'd been doing my usual rounds, checking on campsites and making sure folks weren't leaving trash or getting too close to the wildlife. The only weird thing was the animals. 20 years in these woods, and I know how they act. But that summer was different. The deer stopped coming to their usual spots. The birds went quiet around sunset. Even the squirrels seemed jumpy, chattering at nothing and running off for no reason. Probably just the heat, I told myself. Animals get strange when it's this hot for so long. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every mountain has its legends. The old-timers talked about a devil dog that roamed these hills since before the Civil War. Big as a horse, they said, with yellow eyes and teeth like knives. But I figured that was just talk. Probably came from folks seeing black bears standing up on their back legs. In the dim light of early morning or late evening, a bear could look like almost anything. Besides, I had real problems to worry about. The park seers. Vice was talking about building a new visitor center somewhere between mile markers 80 and 90. That meant surveyors tramping through the woods, disturbing the peace I'd worked so hard to protect. Progress, they called it. I called it a shame. But I was wrong about those stories. Dead wrong. The first real sign something was off came on a Tuesday morning. I was driving up to Overlook Point when I saw smoke rising from the woods. Thought it might be an illegal campfire, so I parked and hiked in to check. What I found wasn't a campfire. It was what was left of the Henderson family's campsite. The tent was shredded, not torn like a bear would do it looking for food. This was different. Long, deep cuts through the fabric, like someone had taken a set of kitchen knives to it. The sleeping bags were scattered around, ripped open with stuffing floating in the air like snow. But the strangest thing was the food. The Hendersons had brought enough supplies for a week. Canned goods, bread, crackers, even a cooler full of meat. All of it was still there, scattered around, but not eaten. Whatever did this wasn't hungry for people food. I found the family huddled behind their car, shaking like leaves. Mrs. Henderson had claw marks on her arm, 4 deep scratches that went from her elbow to her wrist. Her husband kept saying the same thing over and over. It walked like a man, but it wasn't a man. It wasn't a man. Their little girl, couldn't have been more than 8, kept pointing at the trees and whispering, "The big dog is still watching." I looked where she pointed, but didn't see anything. Just shadows between the trees, shifting in the breeze. After I got the Hendersons safely out of the park and to the hospital, I went back to study that campsite. In 20 years of ranger work, I'd seen bear attacks, wildcats, even a few dog bites. This was something else. The claw marks on the ear tent went 8 feet up the side. No bear in Virginia gets that tall. And the tracks I found in the soft dirt near their destroyed camp made my skin crawl. They looked almost like dog prints, but huge. 18 inches long and nearly as wide. The front prints had marks from claws that stuck out past the toes. But here's what really bothered me. They weren't quite right for any 4-legged animal. The back feet looked almost like a man's footprint if a man had thick pads and claws instead of toes. I made plaster casts of the best prints and took pictures of everything. When I got back to the ranger station, I called up Dr. Williams at the State University. He knew more about Virginia wildlife than anyone. "Frank, I've been studying animals for 30 years, he said after I described what I found. "Those injuries you're talking about, the size of those tracks, there's nothing in our woods that could do that. Are you sure you measured right?" I was sure, but I kept that to myself. 2 days later, it happened again. The Morrison family, camping near mile marker 85. Same story. Tent destroyed, family terrified, deep claw marks on Mr. Morrison's back. This time I got there faster, maybe an hour after the attack. The tracks were fresh, and they led into the deep woods, toward the old-growth forest where tourists never went. I followed them. The trail was easy to follow at first. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, even some tufts of dark fur caught on thorns. But as I went deeper into the woods, the signs got stranger. The creature wasn't just running anymore. The tracks showed it had stopped, circled back, even climbed trees, like it was playing games, or like it knew it was being followed. About 2 miles in, the trail just stopped. Not gradually. 1 second there were clear tracks in the soft earth, the next second, nothing. Like whatever I was following had just vanished into thin air. That's when I heard it. A howl, long and low, coming from somewhere up ahead. It sounded like a wolf, but bigger, louder, and there was something else in it. Something that made the hair on my arm stand up. It sounded almost like words, like it was trying to talk. I'd brought my rifle, a .30-06, that could stop a black bear in its tracks. But standing there in those dark woods, listening to that sound echoing off the mountains, I felt like I was carrying a toy. The howl came again, closer this time. And then I heard something that made me turn and run back to my truck faster than I'd moved since the war. An answer, from the other direction. Then another, from my left, and another from my right. Whatever was out there, there was more than one. That night, I set up the park's motion-activated cameras at 3 different spots along the trail. If something was hunting in my woods, I was going to get a picture of it. What I got was worse than no picture at all. The first camera caught something around 2 a.m., a dark shape moving between the trees, but moving so fast the camera couldn't focus on it properly. Just a blur of darkness with 2 glowing spots where the eyes should be. The second camera got a clearer shot an hour later. A massive shape, definitely walking on 2 legs, reaching up to examine the camera itself. The thing was smart enough to know what it was looking at. In the picture, you could see 1 long arm stretched up toward the lens, and fingers. Not paws or claws, but actual fingers with joints and thumbs. The third camera was gone, just gone. I found pieces of it scattered over 100 yards, like something had torn it apart just for fun. But the worst part was what I found the next morning near where the third camera used to be. Scratched into the bark of an old oak tree, 8 feet off the ground, were marks that looked almost like letters. Not English letters, but symbols that seemed to mean something. And below them, driven deep into the wood, were 4 parallel scratches. A signature. Whatever was out there wasn't. Just an animal. It was smart. It could plan. And now it knew I was looking for it. 3 more families got attacked over the next week. Word was getting out and people were starting to cancel their camping reservations. The park superintendent called me into his office and shut the door. "Frank, I need you to find this bear and put it down," he said. "The newspapers are starting to pick up the story. If this gets out of hand, we could lose half our summer visitors." I didn't tell him I was pretty sure it wasn't a bear. That night, I decided to try something different. Instead of following the creature's trail, I would wait for it to come to me. I set up a blind near Hemlock Hollow, where 2 of the attacks had happened, and settled in to wait. The woods were too quiet. No owls hooting, no nightbirds calling. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. Just the wind through the leaves and my own breathing. Around midnight, I smelled it first. A thick, musky smell like wet dog mixed with something wild and sharp, something that had never been tamed. Then I saw the eyes, yellow-green in the darkness, reflecting my flashlight like a cat's. But they were too high off the ground to be any normal animal, and they were watching me with an intelligence that made my mouth go dry. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden moves, I reached for my rifle. The eyes didn't blink, didn't look away. They just watched. Then I heard the breathing, deep, slow breaths from something with big lungs. And it wasn't coming from where the eyes were, it was coming from behind me. I spun around and saw it, 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with a face that was part wolf and part something else. Something that looked almost human around the eyes. It was standing on 2 legs like a man, but its arms were too long and ended in hands with claws instead of fingernails. For maybe 10 seconds, we just stared at each other. I could hear my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could hear it too. The thing tilted its head to one side, like a dog trying to understand a new sound. Then T smiled. Not a dog smile with its tongue hanging out. A human smile, showing teeth too big and sharp for any person's mouth, like it thought something was funny. I raised my rifle, and the thing moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. 1 second it was 20 feet away, the next it was gone, melted back into the shadows like it had never been there at all. But I could still smell it. Still feel those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness. I stayed in that blind until sunrise, listening to things moving around me in the woods. Branches breaking, soft footsteps on dead leaves, and every now and then a low sound that might have been talking in a language I didn't understand. When the sun came up, I found tracks all around my hiding spot. They'd been circling me all night, just out of sight, playing with me. The next day, a surveyor named Pete Collins went missing. He'd been marking trees for the new visitor center, working alone in the deep woods. When he didn't come back to his truck by evening, his crew called me. I found what was left of Pete about a mile from where he'd been working. It wasn't pretty, but what scared me more than what happened to Pete was where I found him. He'd been dragged to a clearing I'd never seen before, even though I'd been patrolling these woods for 20 years. A perfect circle of open ground surrounded by the biggest, oldest trees I'd ever seen. And in the center of the clearing was a cave. Not a natural cave carved by water over millions of years. This one looked like it had been dug out by something with claws. The entrance was perfectly round, just big enough for something the size of what I'd seen the night before. Around the cave mouth, scattered in the grass like decorations, were bones. Deer bones, mostly, but some that looked like they might have come from bigger animals. And sitting on a flat rock next to Maomamas. To the entrance, arranged in a neat pile, were Pete's surveying tools, like an offering. That's when I understood. This wasn't just some rogue animal attacking campers. This was a family, protecting their home, and Pete had been surveying their territory for the new visitor center. I was backing away from the cave when I heard the growling, low and threatening, coming from the dark opening. Then another growl from my left and another from my right. I wasn't just looking at one creature's den. I was standing in the middle of a pack's territory. The first one came out of the cave slowly, watching me with those yellow-green eyes. Bigger than the one I'd seen the night before, with scars on its face and arms. The leader. Two more emerged from the trees on either side, smaller, but still bigger than any wolf, and behind me I heard footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps. 4 of them, maybe more. I kept my rifle ready but didn't point it at any of them. Something told me that if I made the first aggressive move, I wouldn't make it out of that clearing alive. The big one, the leader, took a step toward me, then another. It was so close I could see the individual hairs in its fur, could smell its breath. When it spoke, its voice was like rocks grinding together, but I could understand the words. Your kind takes our home. I almost dropped my rifle. Not just because it could talk, but because of the sadness in its voice. The anger, yes, but underneath that, a deep sadness, like something precious was being lost. I don't want to take anything, I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. I just want to understand. The creature studied my face for a long time. Then it looked at my rifle, at my ranger uniform, at the badge on my chest. When it looked back at my eyes, something had changed. You protect the green places. I nodded slowly. That's my job. The creature turned and said something to the others in that grinding, growling language. Then it looked back at me. Men with machines, mark trees, mark our trees. The surveyor, I said, It. He was marking where they want to build. A low rumble came from all 4 creatures. Not quite a growl, not quite words, but I could feel the anger in it. We will not let them, the leader said. This is our place, our children's place. And that's when I realized the worst part of all this. The attacks weren't random. They weren't going to stop, and they weren't going to stay limited to surveyors and isolated campers. These creatures were getting ready for war. I managed to back out of that clearing without getting killed, but I knew it was just temporary. The pack leader had let me go as a warning, a chance to stop the construction before things got worse. But when I tried to explain to my superintendent that we needed to move the visitor center project, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Frank, you're talking about some kind of... What, werewolves? You've been in these woods too long. Take a vacation. Get some rest. When you come back, I want this bear problem solved. I couldn't blame him. If someone had told me the same story a month ago, I wouldn't have believed it either. 3 days later, they sent in a construction crew to start clearing the site. I tried to stop them, but they had orders from above my pay grade. All I could do was watch as they drove their bulldozers into the woods, toward the clearing where I'd met the pack. The attack came at sunset. I was driving back from town when I saw the smoke. Not the black smoke of a forest fire, but the gray smoke of burning machinery. I floored my truck and got there just as the screaming started. The construction crew's camp was chaos. Bulldozers overturned like toys, trailers ripped open like tin cans, and in the middle of it all, the pack. They moved like shadows, faster than anything that big should move. The workers were running in every direction, but there was nowhere to go. The creatures had rounded the camp. I saw the leader, the big one I'd talked to, pick up a man and throw him 30 feet into a tree. The man hit the trunk and didn't get up. This wasn't just about protecting their territory anymore. This was revenge. I grabbed my rifle and started shooting, not at the creatures, but into the air. The gunshots echoed off the mountains like thunder, and for a moment, everything stopped. The pack leader turned to look at me. Even from 100 yards away, I could see the rage in those yellow eyes. This was my fault. I'd brought these people into their territory. I'd failed to stop the machines, but I was also the only chance any of these workers had of getting out alive. "You want to fight someone?" I shouted. "Fight me!" The creature said something to the others in that grinding language. Then it started walking toward me slowly, like it had all the time in the world. The other pack members melted back into the trees. but I could feel them watching. This was between me and their leader now. When it was close enough that I could see the scars on its face, the creature stopped. "You failed," it said. "Your people still come." "I tried to stop them," I said. "But there are more people, more machines. This won't end with one construction crew." The creature's lips pulled back, showing those terrible teeth. "Then we kill them all." "You can't kill everyone," I said. "There are millions of us. You kill these men, and more will come. More machines, more guns. They'll hunt you down like animals." For the first time, I saw uncertainty in those yellow eyes. "But there's another way," I continued. "Help me save your territory legally. Let me find a way to protect your home without anyone else getting hurt." The creature studied my face for a long time. Behind us, I could hear the injured workers moaning, crying for help. Some of them weren't going to make it if they didn't get to a hospital soon. "You have 3 sons," the creature said finally. 3 sons to make the machines go away. If they are still here—" It didn't finish, he sentenced, but I got the message. The creature stepped aside, and I ran to help the injured workers. By the time the ambulances arrived and we got everyone to safety, the pack was gone. But I knew they were watching, waiting. I had 3 days to find a way to save both the workers and the creatures who called these mountains home. The answer came from an old friend at the state environmental office. Hidden in the paperwork for the construction project was a clause about protected species habitats. If I could prove that the area was home to an endangered animal, the whole project would have to be moved. The problem was proving it without revealing what the animals actually were. I spent 2 days writing the most creative incident report of my career. "A pack of rare Virginia wolves," I wrote, "possibly the last of their kind. Highly territorial and dangerous when threatened." The construction site was right in the middle of their denning area. I backed it up with all the evidence I'd collected, the pictures, the casts of tracks, the hair samples I'd found on branches. I even included testimony from the attacked campers about seeing large wolves near their campsites. On the morning of the 3rd day, I submitted my report, along with a recommendation to relocate the visitor center project to a site 5 miles away. That afternoon, I got a call from the state wildlife office. They were sending a team to investigate immediately. But that evening, I saw lights in the distance. Construction lights. The crew was back. I drove to the construction site faster than I'd ever driven those mountain roads. When I got there, I found the crew setting up for a night shift. They had twice as many men as before, and some of them were carrying guns. "We're not going to let some overgrown dog scare us off," the foreman told me. "We've got a job to do." I tried to explain about the wildlife, investigation, about the need to wait for the official report. But they had orders from corporate, and those orders said to get the job done no matter what. As the sun set behind the mountains, I heard it. The howling. Not just one voice this time, but many. The whole pack calling to each other from different parts of the forest. The construction workers heard it too. Some of them stopped what they were doing and looked toward the tree line with nervous eyes. "Just coyotes," the foreman said, but his voice wasn't as confident as before. The attack came at midnight. This time the pack didn't hold back. They hit the camp from all sides at once, moving like ghosts through the bright construction lights. But instead of focusing on the workers, they went after the machines. I watched one of the creatures tear the engine out of a bulldozer with its bare hands. Another one flipped a trailer truck like it was empty. They weren't trying to hurt people now. They were destroying every piece of equipment they could find. The foreman started shooting, and some of his men joined in. But their bullets didn't seem to do much damage. The creatures were fast, and when a bullet did hit one, it barely slowed them down. That's when I realized something important. These weren't just animals or monsters. They were people in their own way. And they were fighting for their home the only way they knew how. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from my truck and shot it straight up into the air. The red light exploded overhead like a signal. "Stop!" I shouted, loud enough for both the construction crew and the pack to hear. "There's another way." The fighting slowed, then stopped. In the red glow of the flare, I could see the pack leader standing on top of an overturned bulldozer. It was looking at me with those yellow eyes. waiting. "I talked to the state office," I called out. "Your territory is going to be protected. No more construction, no more machines. But you have to stop the attacks." The creature climbed down from the bulldozer and walked toward me. The constructors too. Workers raised their guns, but I motioned for them to wait. "You promise?" the creature asked. "I promise," I said. "But no more killing. The attacks have to stop completely." The creature looked around at its pack, then back at me. Slowly it nodded. "We accept." The pack melted back into the forest as quietly as they'd come, leaving behind a camp full of destroyed machinery and very shaken construction workers. 3 days later, the state wildlife team confirmed my report. The construction site was officially designated as protected habitat for a critically endangered wolf subspecies. The visitor center project was moved to a location 10 miles away, safely outside the pack's territory. I never saw the creatures again, but sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm patrolling the deep woods, I hear them howling in the distance. It's a peaceful sound now, not threatening. Just a family calling to each other in the mountains they call home. The official report says the attacks were carried out by a pack of rabid black bears that had to be relocated. The public bought that story, and tourism numbers went back to normal within a month. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those protected woods, in caves hidden among the oldest trees in Virginia, lives a family that's older than our cities, older than our roads, maybe older than our whole way of life. They're still there, watching over their territory. And as long as people like me remember the promise I made that night, they'll stay hidden, safe in the mountains they've called home for longer than anyone can remember. My name is Frank Mountainheart, and I've been keeping that promise for more than 20 years now. When I retire, I'll pass the story on to whoever takes my place, because some agreements are too important to let die with the people who made them. The mountains have their secrets, and some secrets are earth-keeping. My name is Joseph Fogwalker, but everyone calls me Joe. I've been a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these old mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, bad weather, nothing I couldn't handle. My grandmother always said the Cherokee blood in my veins would help me understand these mountains better than most folks. She told me stories about the Nunahai, the spirit people who lived in the mists. Beautiful stories, she called them. Just stories. It was early spring of 1959 when everything changed. The dogwoods were just starting to bloom, and the morning mist hung thick in the valleys like it always does this time of year. I was working the Cataract Falls area, way up in the backcountry where most tourists don't bother going. The trail's too rough, and you need to know what you're doing to get there safely. That morning started normal enough. I was checking the trail markers after the winter storms when I noticed something odd. The birds had gone quiet. Not just quiet, completely silent. In 30 years of living in these mountains, I'd never heard anything like it. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. I stood there listening to nothing but my own breathing and the distant sound of the waterfall. The hair on my arms stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned around slowly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except the usual mix of oak and pine. Then I heard it. Voices. Soft at first, like people talking far away. But we were miles from any other trail, and I hadn't seen another soul all morning. I followed the sound deeper into the woods, my boots crunching on last year's leaves. The voices got clearer as I got closer to the falls. It sounded like Cherokee. Not the modern Cherokee I'd learned from my grandmother, but something older. The words felt famil, but strange, like hearing your own name spoken in a foreign accent. When I reached the clearing around Cataract Falls, the voices stopped. The silence hit me like a slap. Even the waterfall seemed quieter than usual. I looked around the natural bowl of rocks where Cherokee councils used to meet 100 years ago. Nothing there but mist and moss-covered stones. But something felt wrong. The air was too thick, too still. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since I'd entered the clearing, even though the sun was shining bright overhead. I checked my watch. 9:30 a.m. I'd been walking for an hour, but it felt like I'd just arrived. I made notes in my logbook, trying to stay professional. Unusual acoustic phenomena near Cataract Falls. No visible cause. Recommend further investigation. But my hand was shaking as I wrote. The walk back to my truck took twice as long as usual. I kept stopping to listen, but the normal forest sounds had returned. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, insects humming, like nothing had happened at all. That evening I called my grandmother. She listened quietly as I described what I'd heard. "Joe," she said finally, "some places hold on to old pain. The Nunahai, they're not just stories, they're guardians. If they're speaking again after all these years, there's a reason." I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning brought 3 hikers to my office, all looking pale and shaken. They'd camped near Cataract Falls and heard voices all night long. "It sounded like a whole village talking," said the woman Sarah. She was maybe 40, with expensive hiking gear and the look of someone who'd done this before. But when we used our flashlights, there was nobody there. Her husband Mark nodded. "We recorded some of it." He pulled out a small tape recorder and pressed play. The sound that came out made my blood run cold. Clear Cheech. Iroquois voices speaking in conversation, but the dialect was old, really old. I caught maybe 1 word in 5, and what I understood didn't make sense. They were talking about the return and guarding the sacred places. "Did any of you see anything?" I asked. Their teenage son spoke up. "Shapes in the mist, like people, but..." He shrugged. "They looked through us, like we weren't really there." I took their information and promised to investigate. After they left, I sat in my office staring at that tape recorder. Protocol said I should report this to my supervisor and maybe call in some experts. But something told me this wasn't the kind of problem the Park Service manual covered. I drove back to Cataract Falls, this time bringing my own recording equipment and camera. The trail seemed longer than usual, and I noticed things I'd missed before. Scratches in tree bark that looked almost like writing, stones arranged in patterns that didn't look natural. Small offerings, feathers, carved pieces of wood, left at the base of certain trees. The Cherokee had always said this was a sacred place. Before the removal in 1838, councils met here for over 1,000 years. I'd studied the history, but standing there in the afternoon light, I felt the weight of all those years pressing down on me. I set up my equipment near the center of the clearing and waited. The sun was getting low, and mist was starting to rise from the falls. At first, nothing happened. Then, just as the shadows began to lengthen, I heard them again. This time, I was ready. My recorder was running, and I had my camera ready. The voices started soft and grew louder. Men, women, children, a whole community having conversations that seemed to echo from the rocks themselves. I understood more this time. They were talking about strangers coming, about protecting something important. One voice, deeper than the others, spoke about waiting too long and growing weak. That's when I saw my first one. A figure stepped out of the mist near the waterfall. Tall, wearing traditional Cherokee clothes, thing that looked older than anything I'd seen in museums. He was solid enough to cast a shadow, but something about the light around him was wrong. Too bright, too clean. He looked right at me and spoke in clear English. "Joseph Fogwalker, we have been waiting for you." My hands shook as I raised my camera, but when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The film advance lever wouldn't move. My tape recorder had stopped working too, though the reels were still spinning. "Your grandmother's grandmother knew us," the figure continued. "She understood the old agreements. We stayed to guard what was sacred when the others were forced to leave. But now strangers come with shovels and machines, wanting to dig up what should remain buried." More figures emerged from the mist. Men, women, children in traditional dress. All of them looking at me with eyes that held too much knowledge. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask. "Help us protect this place," the tall figure said. "Scholars come next week with metal tools and no respect. They seek to prove we existed by destroying what we died to protect." The mist suddenly thickened, and when it cleared, they were gone. My equipment started working again immediately. When I played back the tape later, all I heard was the sound of wind and water. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew they'd be back. Dr. Catherine Mills arrived the following Monday with a team of graduate students and enough excavation equipment to dig up half the mountain. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of confidence that comes from 30 years of making important discoveries. "Ranger Fogwalker," she said, shaking my hand with a grip like a vice. "We appreciate the Park Service's cooperation. This site could revolutionize our understanding of Cherokee civilization." I tried to explain about the voices, the strange recordings, the kerns from the tribal council. She listened politely and then dismissed everything with a wave of her hand. "Folklore is fascinating, but we deal in facts. These acoustic phenomena you've reported are probably just wind patterns and echo effects, nothing more." Her team set up camp in the clearing that afternoon. 6 graduate students with more enthusiasm than sense, all excited about their first major dig. I watched them unpack ground-penetrating radar and mark out grid squares with bright orange flags. The Nunahai didn't wait long to respond. The first night, every piece of electronic equipment in their camp stopped working. Cameras, radios, even their digital watches, all dead. Dr. Mills blamed electromagnetic interference from underground mineral deposits. The second night, they woke up to find their gear rearranged in perfect circles around the clearing. No footprints, no signs of how it happened. The orange flags had been replaced with small bundles of sage and sweetgrass. "Practical joke," Dr. Mills announced, though she looked less certain than before. "Local kids, probably." By the third night, her students were getting nervous. 2 of them asked to be transferred to other projects. The remaining 4 huddled in their tents after dark, jumping at every sound. That's when the temperature drop started happening in broad daylight. One minute you'd be working in 70-degree sunshine. The next, you'd be breathing fog in what felt like 40 degrees. The cold always came with whispers, Cherokee voices getting closer and more urgent. I spent those 3 days trying to convince Dr. Mills to relocate the dig, but she was determined to prove that science could explain everything. On Thursday morning, she started the excavation despite my warnings. The first shovel hit the ground at exactly 10 a.m. The response was immediate. A wind came out of nowhere, strong enough to knock over equipment and send papers flying. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in seconds, and the voices rose to a roar. Dozens of Cherokee speakers all talking at once, their words echoing off the rocks like thunder. Then the mist came down like a curtain, so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Dr. Mills' students started calling out to each other, their voices panicked and confused. I could hear them moving around, but in the wrong directions, like the mist was turning them around. When it cleared 20 minutes later, Dr. Mills was on the ground, clutching her chest. Her face was pale and sweating, and she was gasping like she couldn't catch her breath. "Heart attack," she whispered. But she was only 55 and in good health. The doctors at the hospital couldn't find anything wrong with her. They said it was stress. I knew better. That evening, I went back to the clearing alone. The excavation equipment was gone. Not moved, not buried, just gone. The holes they'd dug were filled in so perfectly you couldn't tell where they'd been. The orange flags were replaced with traditional Cherokee prayer bundles. The tall figure was waiting for me near the waterfall. "We do not wish to harm anyone," he said, "but this place holds the bones of our ancestors and the memories of our people. Some things are more important than human curiosity." "The university won't give up," I told him. "They'll send more people, bigger equipment." He nodded sadly. "Then we will have to be more direct. This place was sacred before your people arrived, and it will remain sacred after they leave. We are patient, but we are not weak." More figures appeared in the mist around us. More than before, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all watching me with those ancient eyes. "Help us, Joseph Fogwalker," the tall figure said, "or stand aside while we do what we must." The choice he was offering me wasn't really a choice at all. Dr. Mills returned a week later with twice as many people and 3 times as much equipment. She'd convinced the university that atmospheric disturbances were creating unusual psychological effects that could be overcome with proper scientific methodology. This time, she brought security guards and psychologists to deal with what she called local superstitions and ranger interference. The message was clear. I wasn't welcome at my own site. But the Nunahai had been preparing too. The new team arrived on a Tuesday morning to find the entire clearing transformed. Where there had been flat ground, small hills now rose like burial mounds. Ancient-looking stone markers stood in a perfect circle around the waterfall. Most disturbing of all, the trees around the clearing had grown overnight. Not just a little, but decades worth of growth. Their branches now forming a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. Impossible, Dr. Mills kept saying as she walked around the site. Completely impossible. But impossible was just the beginning. As soon as her team tried to set up their equipment, the real manifestations started. Not just voices now, but full apparitions appearing in broad daylight. Cherokee warriors in traditional dress, standing guard around the stone circle. Women and children watching from the tree line. Elders in ceremonial clothing performing rituals that made the air itself hum with power. The security guards ran first. Tough men with guns reduced to crying children by the sight of spirits who could walk through bullets like they were raindrops. The graduate students followed, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of equipment in their panic to get away. Dr. Mills stood her ground until the very end, even when the Cherokee Council materialized around her. 7 elders in a semicircle, speaking in voices that seemed to come from the earth itself. "This is our place," the eldest said, and his words carried the weight of centuries. "Here, our children learned the old ways. Here, our ancestors sleep. Here, the sacred fire burned for 1,000 years before soldiers came with chains and guns." "You're not real," Dr. Mills whispered. But her voice shook with doubt. "We are more real than your machines," another elder replied. "We are memory made flesh, love that refuses to die, guardians of what cannot be replaced." That's when I stepped into the circle. I'd been watching from the tree line, torn between my duty as a park ranger and my responsibility to my heritage. But seeing Dr. Mills standing there, surrounded by the spirits of my ancestors, I knew what I had to do. "Dr. Mills," I said, "you need to leave. Now." She turned to me with wild eyes. "They can't be real, Joe. There's got to be a scientific explanation." "Some things don't need explaining," I told her. "They just need respecting." The eldest spirit looked at me with something like approval. "Joseph Fogwalker, your grandmother's blood remembers the old promises. Will you speak for us to the world above?" I nodded, feeling the weight of generations settling on my shoulders. "Then, witness," he said. The clearing filled with light, not sunlight, but something older and deeper. In that light, I saw the truth. I saw Cherokee families living here for centuries, children playing by the waterfall, councils making decisions that would shape the future. I saw the soldiers coming, the forced march, the tears of people being torn from the only home they'd ever known. And I saw the Nunihi, the spirit people who chose to stay behind, who gave up their chance to walk the spirit trail so they could guard what was sacred. When the light faded, Dr. Mills was gone. Her equipment was gone too, dissolved into mist and memory. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you help us heal this place," the eldest replied, "and we trust you to keep the outside world from making the same mistakes again." That was 6 months ago. Dr. Mills never came back. In fact, she left archaeology altogether and now teaches elementary school in Ohio. The university officially concluded that the site was geologically unstable and removed it from their list of potential excavation locations. I still work as a park ranger, but my role has changed. The Cherokee Tribal Council appointed me as their official cultural liaison, and I spend most of my time educating visitors about the sacred nature of certain sites. I tell them about Cherokee history, about the removal, about the importance of respecting indigenous heritage. I don't tell them about the Nunahee, not directly, But sometimes, when the mist is thick and the light is just right, visitors to Cataract Falls hear voices speaking in an ancient language. They ask me about it, and I tell them that some places hold on to old memories. I suggest they listen respectfully and maybe leave a small offering, tobacco or cornmeal, as a sign of respect. Most of them think it's just a nice tradition. They don't need to know that the spirits of my ancestors are watching, protecting, remembering. The Nunehis still appear to me sometimes, usually just the tall figure standing by the waterfall in the evening mist. We don't talk much anymore. We don't need to. The understanding between us runs deeper than words. Last week, a group of developers came sniffing around, talking about building a resort near the falls. Their surveying equipment malfunctioned, their vehicles wouldn't start, and they all reported feeling unwelcome in the area. They left after 2 days and haven't been back. The mountains are patient, but they remember everything. And some promises, once made, echo through generations. My grandmother was right about the Cherokee blood in my veins, helping me understand these mountains. But she didn't tell me the whole truth. It's not just about understanding. It's about protecting what can't be replaced. Every morning when I drive to work, I pass the sign for Cataract Falls. Below the official Park Service information, someone has added a small plaque in Cherokee and English. Sacred ground. Tread softly. Listen well. I don't know who put it there. Officially, it's not authorized signage, and I should remove it, but some rules are more important than regulations. And some guardians never clock out. The whispers in the mist remind me of that every day. My name is Marcus Shadowbane, though everyone just calls me Mark. I've been a park ranger at Cumberland Gap for 13 years now, and I thought I knew everything about this place. Every trail, every rock formation, every story the old-timers tell about Daniel Boone and the pioneers who died trying to cross these mountains. I have a PhD in history, which makes me the go-to guy for all the historical stuff. When school groups come through, I'm the one who tells them about the Wilderness Road and how over 300,000 people walked through this gap between 1775 and 1810. A lot of them never made it out alive. It was October 1972, and the leaves were just starting to turn. The temperature had dropped to about 45 degrees, and we were getting that early frost that makes everything look silver in the morning. This is my favorite time of year because the crowds thin out, and you can really feel the history in these mountains. I was up at Pinnacle Overlook doing my usual rounds when Mrs. Henderson from Lexington came running up the trail, breathing hard and looking scared. "Ranger Shadowbane," she said, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong with my pictures." She handed me a stack of photographs she'd just picked up from the drugstore. Regular family vacation shots, her husband posing by the historical marker, their kids playing on the rocks. Nothing unusual, except for one thing. In every single picture, there were extra people, not her family. These were figures in old-fashioned clothes, long dresses, worn coats, wide-brimmed hats. They stood in the background, always just at the edge of the frame. The strange part was that Mrs. Henderson swore they weren't there when she took the pictures. "I would have noticed them," she insisted. "There was nobody else around. We were alone up there." I studied the photos more carefully. The figures were blurry, like they'd moved during the Sul, hot, but their clothes looked authentic. Pioneer-era stuff, the kind of thing you'd see in a museum. "Sometimes shadows can play tricks," I told her, handing back the photos. "These mountains create all sorts of optical illusions." But even as I said it, something cold settled in my stomach. I'd been doing historical demonstrations for years, and those clothes looked too real to be shadows, too detailed. Mrs. Henderson left, but she wasn't the last. Over the next week, 3 more families brought me similar photos. Always the same thing. Mysterious figures in period clothing appearing in pictures taken at historical sites along the Wilderness Road. I started keeping a log. The shadow people, as I began calling them, only appeared in certain spots. Places where, according to my research, pioneers had died. The old campsite where a family froze to death in 1789. The creek crossing where Indians had attacked a wagon train. the steep section where a pregnant woman fell and broke her neck. Every single sighting matched up with a documented death. I told myself it was just coincidence. People see what they want to see, especially in a place with so much tragic history. But late at night, alone in my cabin, I found myself going through the old death records again and again, marking locations on my map with red pins. The pins formed a pattern along the wilderness road like breadcrumbs leading deeper into the mountains. The first time I saw one with my own eyes was during a school demonstration. I was showing a group of 8th graders how pioneers would have made camp using authentic tools and methods. It was getting close to sunset, and the long shadows were creeping across the meadow where we'd set up. I was explaining how they would have arranged their wagon for protection when I noticed something moving at the edge of the clearing. Just a glimpse. A woman in a long brown dress walking between the trees. She moved wrong, like she was floating instead of walking. "Did you guys see that?" I asked the kids. They all turned to look, but there was nothing. There. "See what, Mr. Shadowbane?" asked a girl named Jenny. I scanned the tree line again. Nothing. Just shadows and October wind moving through the branches. "Never mind. Let's head back." But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. That night, I went back to the campsite with my camera and a flashlight. The meadow felt different in the dark, colder, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in white puffs. I started taking pictures, just random shots of the area where I'd seen the woman. When I got the film developed the next day, my hands were shaking as I went through them. There she was, in 3 different photos, clear as day. A woman in pioneer clothing standing exactly where I'd seen her. But in the pictures, I could see through her to the trees behind. I drove to the library in Middlesboro and spent the afternoon going through old records. It took me hours, but I found her. Mary Connolly, age 24, died November 3rd, 1791, in the exact spot where I'd been doing the demonstration. According to the record, she'd been pregnant and got sick on the trail. Her husband buried her in the meadow because the ground was too frozen to dig anywhere else. I sat in my truck outside the library for a long time, staring at the death certificate. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be an explanation. Double exposure, faulty film, trick of the light. But the photos were clear, and I knew what I'd seen. That weekend, I decided to test something. I borrowed an infrared camera from a photographer friend in Knoxville and went back to Mary Connolly's meadow. Infrared film picks up heat signatures that regular film misses. The results made my blood run cold. The meadow was full of them. Dozens of heat signatures in human shapes, all wearing the distinctive outlines of 18th century clothing. Men, women, children, an entire community of the dead, wandering through the grass where they'd been buried. I enlarged one of the photos and studied it under a magnifying glass. The detail was incredible. I could see the weave in their clothes, the expressions on their faces. They looked lost, like they were searching for something, or someone. Monday morning, I was back at work trying to act normal when Bob Martinez, one of the other rangers, pulled me aside. "You okay, Mark? You look like you haven't slept in days." I almost told him everything. Bob's been at the Gap for 20 years. If anyone would understand, it would be him. But how do you explain that you've discovered an entire population of pioneer ghosts living in your park? "Just tired," I said. "Been doing some research." "On what?" "Death records. Trying to map out where pioneers died along the trail." Bob frowned. "Why would you want to do that?" Before I could answer, the radio crackled. "Emergency at the Pinnacle Overlook. Visitors reporting strange sightings." We drove up together and found a family from Ohio standing by their car, looking terrified. The father, a big man in a flannel shirt, was white as a sheet. "They were just standing there," he kept saying. "A whole group of them, dressed like it was Halloween or something. But when I called out, they just disappeared." His wife nodded rapidly. "Like smoke. They were there, then they weren't." Their teenage son was holding a Polaroid camera. "I got pictures," he said quietly. The instant photos were still developing, but you could already see the shapes forming. A group of people in pioneer clothing standing on the overlook, staring out at the valley below. I knew, without having to check, that this was another death site. Probably the spot where that wagon train got lost in the blizzard of 1783. 15 people froze to death right where this family had been taking vacation photos. Equipment malfunction, Bob told them confidently. Happens all the time with cameras up here. Something about the altitude and the magnetic fields in the rocks. The family seemed relieved to have an explanation, even one that made no sense. They packed up and left, taking their impossible photos with them. Bob turned to me. You've seen the death records. How many people died at this exact spot? I looked at him carefully. You know about the records? Mark, I've been here 20 years. You think you're the first person to notice that cameras go crazy in certain places? The first to wonder why people always feel like they're being watched on the wilderness road. Why didn't you ever say anything? Bob lit a cigarette and stared out at the valley. Because some things are better left alone. But lately it's getting worse. More sightings, clearer pictures. It's like they're getting stronger. They? The ones who never left. The ones who are still trying to cross the gap. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Bob had said, that they were getting stronger. I decided to do some real research, the kind they teach you in graduate school. Systematic, thorough, scientific. I started with the assumption that there was a logical explanation. Maybe certain locations had unusual electromagnetic properties that affected photographic equipment. Maybe the stories of pioneer deaths had created a kind of mass hysteria that made people see things that weren't there. But the more I dug, the more the evidence pointed towards something impossible. I went back through 13 years of incident reports. Strange sightings, equipment failures, visitors feeling dizzy or nauseous at specific locations. The pattern was always the same. It happened at documented death sites, and it was getting more frequent. In 1960, there had been maybe one report a year. By 1970, it was one a month. This year alone, I'd logged 17 separate incidents. I decided to spend a night at the most active site, the creek crossing where the Morrison family had been killed by Cherokee Warriors in 1794. According to the reports, this was where the clearest sightings occurred. I set up camp just as the sun was going down, with multiple cameras, a tape recorder, and a thermometer to track temperature changes. If something was really happening here, I was going to document it properly. The first hour was quiet. Just normal forest sounds. Owls, wind in the trees, the creek babbling over the rocks. I made notes every 15 minutes, recording temperature and any unusual observations. At 9:47 p.m., the temperature dropped 12 degrees in less than a minute. At 9:52, my compass started spinning wildly. At 10:15, I heard voices. Not words exactly, but the cadence of human speech coming from the direction of the creek. A man's voice, urgent and frightened. A woman crying. Children asking questions in high, scared voices. I grabbed my camera and followed the sound, using my flashlight to navigate the rocky bank. The voices got clearer as I approached the water, and I could make out a few words. Can't cross in the dark. They'll follow us. Children are so cold. I reached the creek and shined my light across the water. Nothing there. But the voices continued, coming from directly in front of me. I started taking pictures, shooting blindly toward the sound. That's when I saw the blood. Fresh blood on the rocks, dark and wet in my flashlight beam. Drops of it leading from the water up toward the tree line. I knelt down and touched it with my finger, still warm. I followed the blood trail with my camera ready, snapping photos every few steps. The trail led to a cluster of rocks about 50 yards from the creek, then suddenly stopped. No more blood, no footprints, nothing. But there was something else, carved into the largest rock, still sharp and clear after 178 years. J. Morrison, Mary, Little John, Baby Sarah, 1794. I'd found their grave. Marker. The voices had gone quiet, but I could feel them watching me. Not threatening exactly, but intense, like they were waiting for something. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the grave, taking pictures every few minutes and recording everything I observed. The temperature stayed cold, and I kept hearing small sounds, footsteps, whispers, the soft crying of a child. When I developed the film the next day, I had to sit down. Every single picture showed people. The Morrison family, exactly as they would have looked in 1794. John Morrison with a musket in his hands, scanning the tree line for Cherokee warriors. Mary holding a baby and trying to comfort a small boy. But these weren't shadowy figures like in the tourist photos. These were clear, detailed images of people who had been dead for almost 2 centuries. And in every picture, they were looking directly at the camera, looking at me. I started visiting other death sites, armed with infrared film, and growing confidence that I wasn't losing my mind. Each location told its own story. The meadow where the Reynolds party starved in 1788 showed a family huddled around a cold fire, sharing the last scraps of food. The rocky ledge where Samuel Hendricks fell to his death in 1792 showed a man climbing desperately upward, reaching for something just out of frame. But it was more than just seeing them. They were starting to interact with me. At the Hendricks site, I felt invisible hands pushing me away from the edge where he'd fallen. At the Reynolds meadow, I found my equipment mysteriously rearranged in the morning, my cameras pointing towards specific spots where I later discovered unmarked graves. They were trying to communicate, to show me something. But what? The answer came when I was reviewing death records at the county courthouse in Pineville. I was looking up the Henderson massacre of 1791 when the clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, noticed what I was reading. "You researching the Henderson killings?" she asked. "Yeah, for a park project. Why?" My great-great-grandmother was there, only survivor. She used to tell stories about that night. Mrs. Patterson disappeared into the back room and returned with a handwritten journal, the pages yellow and fragile. "Grandmother Martha's account," she said. "Never been published or anything. Family history." I read the journal entry dated September 15th, 1791. The savages came at dawn, killed Papa and Mama and little William while they slept. I hid in the root cellar and watched through a crack in the boards. But the worst part was after. Their souls, all confused and lost, wandering around the camp calling for each other. They couldn't find their way to the light. Something about dying violent keeps them tied to the place where it happened. They're still there, still looking for peace. I stared at the page, my hands shaking. "Mrs. Patterson, can I make a copy of this?" "Sure, honey. But why are you so interested in old ghost stories?" I looked at her carefully. "Have you ever been up to Cumberland Gap, to the historical sites?" "Oh, yes, many times. Beautiful place, though I always feel like I'm being watched when I walk those old trails." "Have you ever seen anything unusual?" She smiled knowingly. "Honey, when you get to be my age, you learn that unusual is just another word for things we don't understand yet. Those mountains are full of old pain. Sometimes pain takes a long time to heal." That night I sat in my cabin reading Martha Henderson's journal over and over. The pieces were falling into place. The pioneer spirits weren't malevolent. They were lost. Trapped between worlds by the violence of their deaths, unable to find rest. And somehow, they were getting stronger, more visible, more desperate to be seen and understood. The question was, what did they want from me? I got my answer 3 days later in the most terrifying way possible. I was hiking the Wilderness Road Trace, documenting sites for what I was starting to think of as my ghost map, when the world suddenly changed around me. One moment I was walking on a well-maintained park trail in 1972. The next, I was stumbling through virgin wilderness that hadn't been touched by human hands. The trail was gone. The interpretive signs were gone. Even the worn path through the rocks had vanished, replaced by thick forest and impassable undergrowth. But somehow I knew exactly where I was. The same stretch of Cumberland Gap, but 180 years earlier. I could hear them before I could see them. Voices, wagon wheels creaking, horses snorting and stamping. The sounds were coming from ahead, where the trail curved around a massive boulder. I crept forward, staying low behind the rocks. What I saw made my blood freeze. A wagon train had stopped in the narrow pass. 4 covered wagons surrounded by maybe 20 people. Men with muskets scanning the ridgelines, women trying to quiet crying children. everyone looking scared and exhausted. I recognized them from my photographs. The Morrison family, the Reynolds family, the Hendersons. All the people I'd been seeing in spirit form, but now they were alive. Real. This was happening. "We can't stay here," John Morrison was saying. "They know we're here. We need to keep moving." "The children can't go any farther," Mary Morrison replied, clutching her baby. "Little Sarah has fever, and John Jr. can barely walk." "Better than being dead," Morrison snapped. "You know what happened to the Wilson party last month, scalped and left for the buzzards." I watched from behind the rocks, my modern ranger uniform suddenly feeling very out of place. This was the night they all died. September 12th, 1794. In about 3 hours, a Cherokee war party would attack this camp. None of these people would see morning. I had to warn them. But when I stood up and stepped out from behind the boulder, none of them could see me. I was the ghost now, the one caught between worlds. I tried shouting, waving my arms, even throwing rocks to get their attention. Nothing worked. And then I understood. This wasn't really 1794. This was some kind of spiritual replay, a memory burned into the landscape by trauma and death. The pioneer spirits weren't just showing me what happened, they were making me live it. The attack came exactly as the historical records described. War cries echoing off the canyon walls, musket fire, screaming. I watched John Morrison fall with a tomahawk in his chest. Saw Mary trying to shield her children as warriors closed in around the wagon. But I also saw something the records had missed. As each person died, their spirits separated from their body, confused, terrified, unable to understand what had happened. They wandered around the massacre site, calling for their families, reaching for loved ones they could no longer touch. They had been trapped here ever since, reliving that night over and over, looking for someone who could see them and help them understand. The scene faded, and I was back in 1972, standing alone on the empty trail. But now I could see them all clearly, without cameras or special equipment. Dozens of pioneer spirits scattered throughout the gap, all of them looking at me with desperate hope. Mary Morrison approached first, carrying the spirit of her baby. "You can see us," she said, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "You can help us." "What do you need?" I asked. "Our bones," said John Morrison, materializing beside his wife. "We were never properly buried. Our remains are scattered through these mountains, lost and forgotten. We can't rest until we're laid to rest with dignity." "And the others?" "All of us," said a new voice. Samuel Hendricks stepped out from behind a tree, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle from the fall that killed him. "Hundreds of us, all along the wilderness road, murdered, starved, frozen, lost. Our bones lie where we fell, unmarked and unmourned." I looked around, at the growing crowd of spirits, men, women, children, all the people I'd been photographing and documenting for weeks. They filled the trail as far as I could see, a procession of the dead, stretching back through 2 centuries. "Some of us have been here so long we've forgotten our names," said an elderly woman in a tattered dress. "But we remember the pain. We remember being abandoned." "What happened to your graves? Your families?" "Some families never knew we died," John Morrison explained. "Others couldn't come back to recover the bodies. Too dangerous, too far. Most of our bones were scattered by animals or buried by landslides. No markers, no records, no one to remember." "But you remember," Mary Morrison added. "You know our stories. You can find us." The magnitude of what they were asking hit me like a physical blow. Hundreds of unmarked graves scattered throughout some of the most rugged terrain in Kentucky. Many would be impossible to locate after so many years. And even if I found them, what then? "I'm just one person," I said. "I can't possibly—" "You're not alone," interrupted a familiar voice. I turned to see Mrs. Patterson's great-great-grandmother, Martha Henderson, walking up the trail toward us. But this wasn't the terrified young woman from the journal. This was an older Martha, wise and determined. "I've been waiting here for 80 years, she said. "Waiting for someone like you. Someone who could see us and understand what needs to be done." "Which is what exactly?" "Build a proper memorial. Mark the graves we can find. Tell our stories so we're not forgotten. Give us the dignity in death that we never had. I looked around at the sea of faces, all of them watching me with desperate hope. These weren't monsters or demons. They were people who had suffered and died far from home, whose only crime was seeking a better life for their families. How do I even start? I asked. Martha Henderson smiled. The same way you've been doing it. Research, documentation. But now we can help you. We know where we died. We know where our bones lit. And we can guide you to places that haven't been found. John Morrison stepped forward. There's a cave system beneath Pinnacle Overlook. 17 members of the Carter Party took shelter there during the blizzard of 1799. They never came out. Their bones are still there, along with their possessions. The Williams family burial ground is hidden behind the waterfall at Devil's Creek, added Mary. 4 children died of fever in 1806. Their father buried them properly, but a rock slide covered the graves 30 years later. One by one, the spirits began sharing locations, each one a piece of the puzzle I'd been trying to solve. Hidden graves, forgotten tragedy sites, places where history had been literally buried. But as the night wore on, I began to understand the real scope of what they were asking. This wasn't just about finding bones and marking graves. It was about preserving their memory, their stories, their humanity. These people had been reduced to footnotes in history books, statistics in mortality tables. They wanted to be remembered as individuals with names and families and dreams that had been cut short. I'll do it, I said finally. I'll help you find peace. The relief that washed over the assembled spirits was almost visible. Some began to fade immediately, as if the simple promise was enough to release them. Others remained, waiting to guide me to their final resting places. Martha Henderson was the last to speak. Thank you, she said simply. We've been alone so long. It means everything to know that someone will remember. As dawn broke over Cumberland Gap, I was alone again on the empty trail. But now I had work to do. Real work, the kind that might take the rest of my life. But for the first time in weeks, the mountains felt peaceful. It took me 3 years to find them all. 3 years of hiking unmarked trails with spirit guides only I could see. 3 years of convincing park administrators that Cumberland Gap needed a comprehensive archaeological survey. 3 years of paperwork, permits, and carefully worded reports that never mentioned the real reason I knew where to dig. The Carter family cave was first. 17 skeletons arranged in a circle, still wearing the remnants of 18th century clothing. Their possessions told the story: a child's wooden toy, a woman's wedding ring, a Bible with family names written on the fly page. I photographed everything, documented every detail, treated them with the respect they'd been denied for 173 years. The Williams children's grave was harder to reach, requiring rappelling equipment to get behind the waterfall. But they were there, exactly where Mary Morrison had said they'd be. 4 small skeletons in a neat row, with a stone marker their father had carved by hand. Here lie my angels, taken too soon, 1806. Each discovery led to another. The spirits guided me through the mountains like a living GPS system, pointing out landmarks that only they remembered. A twisted tree that had grown around a grave marker, a rock formation that had collapsed over a family cemetery, springs that had been diverted to cover burial sites. I worked with archaeologists from the University of Kentucky, spinning stories about ground-penetrating radar and historical research to explain my uncanny ability to locate remains. They were impressed by my accuracy rate. They called me gifted, if they only knew. The memorial garden was dedicated in 1975 just off the main visitor center. Simple granite markers bearing the names and stories of 247 pioneers who had died crossing Cumberland Gap. Each stone was placed according to spirit guidance, marking not where they died, but where they had chosen to rest. The dedication ceremony was small. Just park officials, a few descendants we'd managed to track down, and a reporter from the local newspaper. But as I spoke about the courage and sacrifice of the pioneers, I could see them gathered around the edges of the crowd. Hundreds of spirits, finally visible in daylight, finally at peace. One by one, they began to fade. Mary Morrison gave me a final nod of gratitude before disappearing with her children. John Morrison saluted respectfully before vanishing into the morning mist. Martha Henderson smiled and mouthed, "Thank you," before dissolving into golden light. By the end of the ceremony, they were all gone. For the first time in 13 years, Cumberland Gap felt like a normal place. No cold spots, no mysterious photographs, no feeling of being watched. Just a beautiful mountain park with a rich but peaceful history. But I wasn't the same person who had started this journey. I kept the infrared camera, though I rarely needed it anymore. The sensitivity that had allowed me to see the pioneer spirits had never fully left me. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. A Civil War soldier on the old battlefield roads, a Cherokee warrior watching from the ridgelines, a mountain family from the Depression era walking along forgotten trails. Cumberland Gap had always been a place where people passed through, leaving pieces of their lives and sometimes their deaths in the ancient stones. I'd become the keeper of those stories, the bridge between the living and the dead. The memorial garden became one of the most visited sites in the park. Families would come to see if their ancestors were among the names on the stones. Genealogists used it as a research starting point. School groups learned about the real human cost of westward expansion. And sometimes, late at night when I was doing my rounds, I'd see a figure standing among the markers, not one of the pioneer spirits. They had found their peace. These were new visitors, family members who had come to pay respects to ancestors they'd never known were buried here. The dead, I learned, don't always stay dead, but with the right help, they can learn to rest. I retired from the Park Service in 1990, but I still live in the area. Still get calls from rangers who have questions about unusual incidents on the Wilderness Road. I help when I can, always remembering Martha Henderson's words about pain taking time to heal. The mountains are full of old pain. But sometimes, if you're willing to listen and remember, you can help ease that pain. Sometimes, you can help the lost find their way home. Ranger Marcus Shadowbane served at Cumberland Gap National Historical Park from 1959 to 1990. The Pioneer Memorial Garden, established through his research and advocacy, honors the memory of 247 men, women, and children who died crossing the Cumberland Gap between 1775 and 1810. The memorial remains open to visitors year-round, and park rangers report no unusual incidents at documented historical sites since its dedication in 1975. My name is Samuel Thornfield, but everyone calls me Sam. I've been a park ranger for 14 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, rock slides, you name it. I've pulled people out of situations that would make your hair turn white. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in November of 1981. I work in the Cranberry Wilderness in West Virginia. It's 35,000 acres of roadless land, sitting up at 4,000 feet where the air gets thin and the weather turns mean fast. Most people don't know places like this still exist. Untouched wilderness where you can walk for days without seeing another soul. The forest up there is different too. It's what we call a boreal ecosystem, like something you'd find way up in Canada. Ancient trees, thick moss, and bogs that have been the same for thousands of years. I love my job, don't get me wrong. After 12 years in the Army teaching survival skills, being alone in the wilderness feels like home. I can find my way by the stars, build shelter from nothing, and track anything that moves. The mountains speak to me in a language most folks never learn. But that November was different from the start. The animals were acting strange, deer running in broad daylight for no reason, birds going quiet when they should be calling. Even my dog Rex, who comes with me on patrol, kept whining and looking over his shoulder like something was following us. The weather turned early that year. By Thanksgiving week, we had 3 feet of snow and temperatures dropping to 15 below. Most sensible people stay home in weather like that. But there's always someone who thinks they know better. That someone was David Chen, a nature photographer from Pittsburgh. 32 years old, experienced hiker, all the right gear. He'd gotten a permit to photograph the high bogs in winter. Said he wanted to capture the untouched beauty of primeval wilderness. His words, not mine. David was supposed to check in by radio every day at 6 p.m. First day, nothing. Second day, still nothing. By the third day, my gut was telling me something was wrong. Real wrong. I found his base camp on the fourth day. Everything was there. Tent, sleeping bag, most of his food. But David was gone, and so was his camera gear. The weird part was how his stuff was scattered. Not like a bear had gotten into it. Not like the wind had blown things around. More like someone had gone through everything piece by piece, looking for something specific. The tracks around his camp made my skin crawl. I've been tracking for 20 years, and I'd never seen anything like them. 4 limbs, moving in a crawling pattern. But the hands, they looked human. Too human. And they led straight up a cliff face that should have been impossible to climb. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with anything normal. I called in a rescue team the next morning. 3 good men, Jake Morrison, a medic and climber, Tony Russo, our best tracker, and Bill Hayes, who knew the high country better than anyone. We loaded up with winter survival gear, ropes, and enough supplies for a week. The plan was simple. Follow David's trail, find him alive if possible, and get everyone home safe. I'd done dozens of rescues just like this one. Should have been routine. But nothing about this felt routine. We found David's camera on the second day. It was hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, the strap wrapped around the limb like someone had deliberately placed it there. Tony shimmied up to get it while the rest of us searched the area below. The memory card was still intact. Most of the photos were normal. Beautiful shots of snow-covered trees, ice formations, the kind of thing you'd expect. Heat. But the last dozen photos made us all go quiet. They showed something moving through the trees in the distance. At first, it looked like it might be a person crawling on hands and knees. But as the photos progressed, you could see it wasn't human. Not entirely. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, and the way it moved, flowing between the trees like water, was nothing I'd ever seen. In the final photo, taken with a zoom lens, you could make out details that made my hands shake. Pale skin stretched tight over bones, hair that looked more like moss than anything human, and eyes that reflected the camera flash like an animal's. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake whispered. I didn't have an answer. In all my years in these mountains, all the old stories I'd heard from local folks about things in the deep woods, I'd never seen anything like this. We pressed on, following the strange tracks deeper into the wilderness. The weather was getting worse, wind picking up and temperature dropping. But we had to find David. Dead or alive, we had to bring him home. That's when we started hearing the sounds. It began as we set up camp that evening. A voice calling out from the darkness beyond our fire. "Help! Help me! Please!" It sounded like David. Same voice, same accent, but something was off about it. The words came too slowly, like whoever was speaking had to think about how to make each sound. "David?" I called back. "David, is that you? Stay where you are, we're coming." But when we searched with flashlights, we found nothing. Just more of those impossible tracks leading away into the darkness. The voice kept calling all night, sometimes close, sometimes far away. "Help me. So cold. Can't feel my legs." None of us slept much. Every time someone would start to doze off, that voice would come drifting through the trees again. By morning, we were all on edge. That's when Tony found the first body. It wasn't David. It was someone we'd never seen before, partially buried in the snow about 50 yards from our camp. Male, middle-aged, wearing hikey, and gear that looked like it had been through a blender. But the strange thing was the position. He was arranged, laid out neat and careful, arms crossed over his chest like he was in a coffin. And he'd been there for weeks, maybe months. The cold had preserved him, but this wasn't a recent death. This was something else entirely. "This isn't right," Bill said, backing away from the body. "This whole thing isn't right. We need to get out of here." But I couldn't leave. Not without David. not without answers. That was my first mistake. The attack started on the third night. We'd found 2 more bodies by then, both arranged the same way, both preserved by the cold. All the equipment was accounted for, but the people were dead, killed by something with claws and incredible strength. I was on watch when I heard something moving around the edge of our camp. Not the voice this time, actual movement. Branches snapping, snow crunching under weight. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, moving slowly toward the sound. 20 feet from the fire, I stopped. There in the snow were fresh tracks. The same 4-limbed crawling pattern we'd been following, but these were huge. Bigger than anything we'd seen before. And they circled our entire camp. Whatever this thing was, it had been watching us sleep. "Everyone up!" I shouted. "We've got company!" The guys rolled out of their sleeping bags, grabbing weapons and lights. But as we swept the area, we found nothing except those tracks. Tracks that led straight up another vertical cliff face and disappeared. "How is that possible?" Jake asked, shining his light up the rock wall. "Nothing can climb like that." That's when we heard it. A sound from above us, like laughter. But wrong. Stretched out and echoing, like someone trying to remember how laughing was supposed to sound. We all looked up, but our lights couldn't reach that high. Sometimes Hing was up there, looking down at us, watching, waiting. We broke camp before dawn and started moving. The tracks we'd been following split into multiple trails, like our stalker was trying to confuse us. But Tony was good at his job. He picked the freshest trail and led us deeper into the wilderness. That afternoon we found David's pack. It was hanging from a tree like his camera had been, but this time it was 30 feet up, and the tree was smooth bark, no branches to climb. Inside the pack we found David's journal. The last entry was dated a week ago. "Something is following me. I can hear it at night, moving around my camp. It sounds like a person, but the way it moves, God help me, I think it's learning. Yesterday it tried to talk. It said my name, but the voice was all wrong. Like it was trying on my voice like a coat. I'm going to try to get out tomorrow. If anyone finds this, don't look for me. Just run." That night, Tony disappeared. I woke up to Jake shaking me. "Sam, Tony's gone. His sleeping bag is empty, but there's no sign of struggle." We searched everywhere, calling his name. Found his tracks leading away from camp, but they stopped after about 20 yards. Just stopped. Like he'd been picked up and carried away. That's when we heard Tony's voice calling from the darkness. "Guys, over here! I found something!" But Jake grabbed my arm. "That's not Tony," he whispered. "Look!" He pointed to Tony's gear, still laying next to his empty sleeping bag. His boots, his coat, everything he'd need to survive in this cold. The voice kept calling. "Hurry! I'm hurt! I need help!" It was Tony's voice, his exact voice. But Tony was somewhere out there without his boots, which meant he was probably dead. Which meant something else was using his voice to try to lure us away from camp. We didn't answer. We just sat by the fire with our backs together, weapons ready, waiting for dawn. In the morning we found Tony. He was arranged like the others, laid out neat and careful about a mile from camp, but he'd only been dead a few hours. Whatever killed him had kept him alive through the night, probably to use his voice. Bill lost it then, started crying, saying we were all going to die, that we should have left days ago. He wasn't wrong, but I still couldn't abandon David. Not until I knew for sure. That was my second mistake. We found David on the 5th day. He was alive, sort of. We discovered him in a cave about 2 miles up from where we'd found Tony. But when I say alive, I mean something was keeping him alive. Something that had been feeding on him, little by little, keeping him fresh. David was unconscious, hanging from the cave ceiling by some kind of organic webbing. His arms and legs were covered in bite marks, neat and precise, like something had been taking careful portions. But the wounds were treated somehow, kept from bleeding too much. And he wasn't alone. There were others in that cave, 7 people, all hanging the same way, all in different stages of harvest. Some had been there for months. One looked like he'd been there for years. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered. "What is this place?" That's when we saw it, the thing we'd been tracking. It came flowing down from the ceiling like a spider, but bigger, much bigger. It had been human once, you could tell from the basic shape. But whatever it had become was something else entirely. It moved on all fours, joints bending in ways that should have been impossible. Its skin was pale and stretched tight, like it had outgrown its original body. The hair was long and matted, hanging down like moss. And the eyes were still human, intelligent, aware. It looked at us for a long moment, tilting its head like a curious animal. Then it spoke, using David's voice. "You shouldn't have come here. This is my place now." The voice came from the wrong place on its body. Not from a mouth, but from somewhere in its chest, like it was speaking through hello, those spaces inside itself. "Let them go," I said, raising my rifle. "Let them all go and we'll leave. We won't tell anyone." It laughed, and the sound was horrible, like breaking glass mixed with crying. "I was like you once," it said, switching to Tony's voice now. "Lost in these mountains, starving. The cold changes you if you let it. Makes you strong. Makes you better." Then it moved. I've never seen anything move that fast. 1 second it was hanging from the ceiling, the next it was on Bill. He screamed once before those claws opened his throat. Jake and I opened fire, but our bullets just punched through its body without slowing it down. It flowed around our shots like water, impossibly fast and graceful. "The cave!" I shouted. "Block the entrance!" We had explosives for emergency rock slides, part of our rescue gear. Jake grabbed the charges while I kept shooting, trying to keep that thing away from the people hanging from the ceiling. But it was too smart. Instead of attacking us directly, it started cutting down its prisoners. David fell to the cave floor with a wet thud, followed by the others. Some were already dead, but a few were still breathing. "You want to save them?" the creature asked, using my own voice now. "Come and get them." That's when I realized what we were really dealing with. This wasn't just some animal that had learned to mimic human speech. This thing had been human once, and it remembered. It knew exactly what would hurt us most. Jake finished setting the charges. 30 seconds, he yelled. I grabbed David and threw him over my shoulder. Jake got one of the others, a woman who was still breathing. We ran for the cave entrance as that horrible laughter echoed behind us. The explosion brought down half the mountain. David lived. Barely. He spent 3 months in the hospital, and he's never been the same since. Doesn't talk much about what happened, and when he does, people think he's crazy. The official report blamed the whole thing on equipment failure and exposure. 4 men went into the wilderness. 2 came back. Happens. More often than you'd think in country like that. But I know the truth. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that thing we left buried under tons of rock and snow. I think about what it said, that the cold changes you, makes you stronger. I think about how it had been human once. The area around that cave is restricted now. Officially, it's due to unstable rock formations from the explosion. But I know there are people watching it, government types with expensive equipment and serious faces. Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there, other people who got lost in the deep wilderness and changed into something else, something that remembers being human but isn't anymore. I still work these mountains, but I don't go alone anymore. And I always check in by radio every 6 hours, no matter what, because I learned something important in that cave. The wilderness doesn't just kill you if you're not careful. Sometimes if you stay too long, if you go too deep, it changes you into something that belongs to it forever. And late at night, when the wind is howling through the trees and the temperature drops below 0, I sometimes hear voices calling from the darkness. Familiar voices, saying familiar things. Help me. So cold. Can't feel my legs. But I don't answer anymore. Because I know those voices aren't calling for help. They're calling for company. My name is Samuel Thornfield, and I've been a park ranger for 28 years now. I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong, and sometimes I'm afraid I'll be wrong again. My name is Benjamin Colburner, but everyone calls me Ben. I've been a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 17 years now, and I thought I knew every inch of these mountains. Boy, was I wrong. I should tell you about Cades Cove first. It's this big valley tucked away in the Tennessee side of the park, about 11 miles around if you drive the loop road. Most folks come for the old cabins and churches from the 1800s. What they don't know is that real families lived here for over 100 years, before the government made them all leave in 1944 to create the park. My own great-great-grandfather was born in one of those cabins. The Colburners had been here since 1818, working the land, raising kids, burying their dead in the little cemeteries scattered around the valley. When I got this job, I felt like I was coming home. The morning everything started was in late April 1966. I remember because the dogwood trees were blooming white against the green hills, and there was still a chill in the air that made your breath fog up. I was driving the loop road early, before the tourists showed up, checking on the historic buildings like I did every few days. That's when I saw Mrs. Henderson from Knoxville standing by the old Elijah Oliver cabin, pointing at something and talking real excited to her husband. They flagged me down when they saw my ranger truck. "Ranger," she said, her voice all shaky. There was a woman hanging laundry on that line behind the cabin. She was wearing one of those old-timey dresses, long sleeves and everything. But when we got closer to take a picture, she just disappeared. Mr. Henderson nodded. Vanished like smoke. Laundry was gone too. I smiled and gave them my usual speech about how the mind can play tricks in the early morning mist, how shadows can look like people sometimes. But I walked over to check any what was. There wasn't any clothesline behind that cabin. Never had been, according to the historic records. The Hendersons weren't the first visitors to report strange things that spring. In March, a family from Georgia said they saw a man plowing a field that had been empty for 20 years. Last week, some teenagers claimed they heard church bells ringing from the old Methodist church, even though there hadn't been bells in that tower since 1943. I figured it was just people's imaginations running wild. This place had that effect sometimes. All those empty cabins and grown-over fields made you think about the families who used to live here. Maybe folks wanted to see the past so bad they started making it up. But then I found the photographs. That afternoon, I was going through some pictures that visitors had dropped off at the ranger station. People loved to share their Cades Cove photos with us. Most were the usual shots of deer and old buildings, but 3 different families had captured something else. In a photo from the Tipton place, you could see a figure in a long dress feeding chickens behind the cabin. Problem was, we don't keep chickens there. In another shot of the Cantrell cabin, there was smoke coming from the chimney and a man sitting on the porch. We never light fires in those fireplaces. The 3rd photo showed the cable mill with water running and someone working inside, but that mill wheel hasn't turned in over 20 years. I stared at those pictures for a long time. The figures looked real enough, not like double exposures or camera tricks. They were just there, doing everyday things like they'd never left. That night, I called my grandmother in Maryville. She was 93 and sharp as a tack, one of the last people who remembered when families still lived in the cove. "Granny," I said, "you ever hear tell of spirits or ghosts hanging around the old homesteads?" She was quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said, "Benjamin, some folks never did leave that valley. When the government made them go, it broke their hearts. Land like that, worked by your hands, and your daddy's hands, and his daddy's hands. Well, that gets in your blood. Some people, when they die, their spirits go back to the place they loved most. But Granny, these aren't dead people. The folks I'm hearing about left the cove in the 1940s. Most of them are probably still alive somewhere." Another long pause. "Maybe their hearts never left, Benjamin. Maybe part of them stayed behind, keeping house, waiting for the rest to come home." I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about those photos and what my grandmother had said. The next morning, I decided to take a closer look at the buildings where people had reported sightings. The fog was thick when I got to the cove around sunrise. It hung in the valley like cotton, making everything look soft and far away. I parked by the Elijah Oliver place and walked around back where Mrs. Henderson had seen the woman hanging laundry. The grass was wet with dew, and I could see my own footprints in the soft ground. But there were other prints too, smaller ones, like a woman's shoes. They led from the cabin to where a clothesline might have hung, then back to the cabin. The prints looked fresh. My hands were shaking a little as I followed them to the back door. The Park Service kept all these cabins locked up tight, but when I tried the handle, it turned. Inside, the cabin felt warm, like someone had been cooking. I could smell biscuits and coffee, even though there wasn't any kitchen equipment in there anymore. On the old wooden table, there was a cup of coffee still steaming. I backed out of that cabin fast and didn't stop until I was in my truck with the doors locked. My radio crackled to life. Another visitor report. This time at the John Cable cabin about 2 miles away. As I drove through the fog, I realized something that made my skin crawl. The coffee cup, those footprints, the warm smell of cooking. None of it should have been possible. But it was there. It was real. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I started to wonder if my great-great-grandfather's stories about the cove were more than just family tales. He used to say the land remembered everything, every birth, every death, every goodbye. He said if you listened close enough, you could still hear the voices of everyone who'd ever lived there. I was about to find out he was right. The John Cable cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by split-rail fence, just like it had when the Cable family lived there in the 1920s. What made my blood run cold was that the fence had been repaired. Last week, 3 of those rails had been broken and lying on the ground. Now they were back in place, cut and fitted like someone who knew what they were doing had spent time fixing them. The visitors waiting for me were a young couple from Nashville, both pale as sheets and holding on to each other like they might blow away. "Ranger, thank God you're here," the woman said. "We saw a whole family working around this place. A man was chopping wood, a woman was hanging laundry, and kids were playing in the yard. But when we got out of our car to look closer, they all stopped what they were doing and stared at us. Just stared. The man started walking toward us, and we got scared and got back in the car. When we looked again, they were gone." The man nodded fast. It wasn't like they ran away. They just weren't there anymore. "But Ranger, the woodpile is bigger than it was when we drove up. Someone chopped that wood." He was right. There was a neat stack of split logs by the cabin door, enough to last a family through winter. The axe was still there too, stuck in the chopping block like someone had just finished using it. I sent the couple on their way, telling them they'd probably seen park maintenance workers, even though I knew we hadn't had any crews scheduled for this area. Then I called my supervisor, Jim Morrison, on the radio. "Jim, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Have we had any maintenance crews working on the historic buildings this week?" "Negative, Ben. Budget cuts, remember? We can barely afford to keep the grass cut, much less repair those old fences. Why?" I looked at the fresh-cut wood, the fixed fence, the axe that was still warm to the touch. "No reason. Just checking." I spent the rest of the morning driving the loop road, and everywhere I went, I found signs that someone had been taking care of the old homesteads. The Tipton place had fresh flowers planted around the porch. The Methodist church had been swept clean, and someone had oiled the door hinges. The cable mill had new boards in places where old ones had rotted away. But it was what I found at the old cemetery that really shook me up. The Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery sits on a little hill overlooking the whole valley. Most of the graves date back to the 1800s and early 1900s. The Cables, the Tiptons, the Olivers, and dozens of other families who lived and died in the cove. I'd been there hundreds of times to give tours to visitors who wanted to hear the old stories. Today, every single grave had fresh flowers on it. Not store-bought flowers, but wild flowers and mountain laurel picked from the woods around the cemetery. Someone had also cleaned all the headstones and pulled the weeds from around the graves. It would have taken days of work to do all that. I was kneeling by one of the graves, looking at flowers that were still wet with morning dew, when I heard voices. They were coming from down in the valley, drifting up through the fog. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like people calling to each other, like families do when they're working together. I stood up and looked down toward the cabins. Through the mist, I could see smoke rising from several chimneys, thin gray streams that looked just like what you'd see on a cold morning when folks were cooking breakfast. My radio crackled again. "Ben, this is dispatch. We've got another report. Family at the Cantrell cabin says they're hearing children playing and laughing, but they can't see anyone." I walked fast down the hill toward my truck, but the voices in the valley were getting louder. Now I could make out some words. A woman calling, "Supper's ready," and children laughing and shouting. It sounded like a normal family morning, except there hadn't been families living in Cades Cove for over 20 years. By the time I got to the Cantrell cabin, the fog was starting to lift. The family who'd called it in was still there. Mom, Dad, and 2 little girls who were holding tight to their parents' hands. "Ranger," the dad said, "our girls heard kids playing behind that cabin. Sounded like tag or hide and seek, but there's nobody there. We walked all around the building, and there's no sign of any children." One of the little girls spoke up. "The kids asked us to play with them. A boy said his name was Tommy and asked if we wanted to see their fort in the woods." "What did you tell them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We said yes, but Daddy wouldn't let us go. The boy said maybe next time, and then we couldn't hear them anymore." The parents looked at me like they expected me to explain everything, make it all make sense. But I was starting to think nothing in Cades Cove was going to make sense anymore. After they left, I sat in my truck and tried to think. 17 years I'd been working these mountains, and I'd never seen anything like this. The logical part of my mind said there had to be explanations. Maybe some local families were sneaking into the cove to maintain their old family places. Maybe it was park employees I didn't know about. Maybe it was my imagination running away with me. But deep down I knew better. Those voices in the fog, the impossible repairs, the fresh flowers on graves that nobody visited anymore, this wasn't something normal people were doing. That's when I remembered the box of old papers in my truck. I kept copies of all the historical documents about Cades Cove families, including the records of when they were forced to leave in the 1940s. I pulled out the file and started reading. The Cable family, John, his wife Becky, and their 4 children, including a boy named Tommy, had been the last ones to go. They'd fought the government's decision to take their land right up until the sheriff came to escort them out in December 1944. According to the report, John Cable had said, "You can make our bodies leave, but our hearts will always be here. This land is in our blood, and someday we'll come home." I looked up at the Cantrell cabin, where a little girl had just heard a boy named Tommy ask her to play. John Cable had died in 1958, according to the records. His wife Becky passed in 1961, but their boy Tommy would be about 30 now, if he was still alive. So who was the child asking little girls to come play in the woods? The fog was almost gone now, and I could see clear across the valley to where the Cable cabin sat. There was no smoke coming from the chimney anymore, no sound of voices in the air. Everything looked normal again, just like it was supposed to. But normal wasn't going to cut it anymore. I had a feeling this was just the beginning, and whatever was happening in Cades Cove was going to get a lot stranger before it got better. I started my truck and headed back to the ranger station. I needed to do some serious research, and I needed to figure out what to tell my supervisor when he asked for a report. Because somehow, I didn't think "the dead are coming home" was going to go over real well. By the time I got back to the ranger station, I had 5 more radio calls waiting for me, all from Cades Cove, all reporting the same impossible things: people in old-fashioned clothes working around the historic buildings, children playing where no children should be, smoke from cold chimneys, and the sound of families going about their daily lives. I spread all the historical documents across my desk and started making connections. Every single sighting matched up with a family that had lived in that exact spot. The woman hanging laundry behind the Oliver cabin. That would be Martha Oliver, who'd raised 7 children there. The man chopping wood at the Cable place, John Cable himself, who'd cut wood for his family's stove every morning for 30 years. But here's what really got to me. According to the death records I found, most of these people were still alive. John Cable was dead, yes, and so was his wife. But their son Tommy was living in Knoxville. Martha Oliver was in a nursing home in Maryville. The man visitors had seen plowing the field near the Tipton place looked just like Ernest Tipton, who was 68 years old and living with his daughter in Sevierville. So how could people see them working their old farms? I was still puzzling over this when my radio crackled with an emergency call. "Ben, you need to get to the cable mill right now. We've got a situation." When I got there, I found 6 tourists standing around looking scared and confused. The mill wheel was turning, water rushing through the old wooden gears, and you could hear the grinding stones working inside the building. But we'd shut that mill down permanently 5 years ago. The water had been diverted, and the machinery was locked up tight. "Ranger," one of the tourists said, "there's someone inside there. We can hear them working, moving around, talking to themselves. But the door is locked, and we can't see anyone through the windows." I had the key to the mill, but my hands were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to get it in the lock. When the door finally opened, the sound hit me, like a physical force. The rumble of the grinding stones, the splash of water, the creak of wooden gears. Everything was working just like it had 50 years ago. But there was nobody there. The water wheel was turning on its own. The stones were grinding nothing into flour, and the whole building felt warm and alive. On the workbench, there was a pile of fresh corn, ground into meal so fine you could run it through your fingers like sand. I backed everyone out of there and locked the door, but I could still hear the machinery running. It kept going all afternoon, and every time a new group of tourists came by, they could hear it too. That evening, I called my grandmother again. "Granny, I need to know more about what you said yesterday, about people's hearts never leaving the cove." She sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't call back about that, Benjamin. Some things are better left alone. Granny, I can't leave this alone. Strange things are happening here, and I need to understand what I'm dealing with." Another long pause. Then she said, "Your great-great-grandfather told me once that when the government made folks leave the cove, it was like tearing their souls in half. Those families had been there so long, they were part of the land itself. When you force someone to leave the place where their daddy is buried, where their babies took their first steps, where they plan to live and die, well, sometimes part of them just refuses to go." "But Granny, most of these people are still alive. I checked the records." "Bodies can be in one place while hearts are in another, Benjamin. Maybe what folks are seeing isn't ghosts exactly. Maybe it's the part of those people that never left home." That night, I decided to stay in the cove after dark. I'd never done that before. Park policy was that all staff had to be out before sunset. But I needed to see what happened when the tourists were gone and the valley was empty. I parked my truck behind the visitor center and walked out onto the loop road just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, the Vias. Ellie filled up with purple shadows, and the air got cold enough to make me zip up my jacket. For about an hour, everything was quiet. Just the normal sounds of night in the mountains, owls calling, wind in the trees, the distant sound of water running in the creek. Then, around 9 o'clock, lights started coming on. Not electric lights. There wasn't any electricity in the old buildings. These were warm, yellow lights, like oil lamps and candles. One by one, the windows of the historic cabins began to glow, and thin streams of smoke started rising from the chimneys. I could hear voices again, but clearer now. A woman singing while she washed dishes. A man reading aloud from what sounded like the Bible. Children being called in for the night. The everyday sounds of families settling down after a long day of work. I walked closer to the cable cabin, drawn by the sound of a fiddle playing a slow, sad tune. Through the window, I could see shadows moving around inside. A man sitting by the fire. A woman mending clothes, children playing on the floor. When I got close enough to look in, I saw John Cable himself, just like in the old photographs. He was younger than in the pictures, maybe 40 years old, with his sleeves rolled up and his fiddle tucked under his chin. His wife Becky was sitting in a rocking chair, sewing by lamplight. Their kids were scattered around the room, playing with simple wooden toys. They looked so real, so normal, so alive, that I almost knocked on the door to say hello. But when John Cable looked up from his fiddle and stared straight at me through the window, I realized his eyes were the saddest things I'd ever seen. He stood up slowly and walked to the window. When he put his hand up against the glass, I could see through it like he was made of smoke. He mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I could read his lips. Help us. Then he faded away, and the light in the cabin went out. I stood there in the dark for a long time, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I finally got back to my truck, my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely start the engine. But as I drove out of the valley, I could see the lights still glowing in most of the cabins, families going about their evening routines, just like they had every night for 100 years. Except now, they were stuck there, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead, unable to truly live but unable to rest. And John Cable had asked me to help them. The question was, help them do what? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw John Cable's face at the window, those sad eyes and his mouth forming the word help. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going back to the cove, and this time I was going to find out exactly what these spirits wanted from me. I called in sick to work and drove to the valley just after sunrise. The fog was thick again, rolling through the trees like something alive. But instead of going to the visitor center, I parked at the old primitive Baptist church and climbed the hill to the cemetery. If I was going to talk to the dead, a graveyard seemed like the right place to start. I found John Cable's grave near the back of the cemetery, marked with a simple stone that read, John Cable, 1898 to 1958, beloved father. Someone had left fresh mountain laurel on it, and the stone looked like it had been cleaned recently. Mr. Cable, I said out loud, feeling foolish but desperate. My name is Benjamin Colburner. My people lived in this valley too, and I think you're trying to tell me something. If you can hear me, if you need help, I'm here to listen. For a minute, nothing happened except the wind rustling through the trees. Then the fog started to swirl around me, getting thicker and thicker until I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. When it cleared, I wasn't alone. They were all there, dozens of people in clothes from the 1920s and 1930s, standing among the graves like they were attending a church service. I recognized some faces from old photographs, John and Becky Cable, Martha Oliver, Ernest Tipton, and many others. But these weren't the spirits I'd seen through cabin windows. These people looked solid, real, almost alive. An old man stepped forward, someone I didn't recognize but who carried himself like a leader. You're Samuel Colburner's great-great-grandson, he said. I can see it in your face. I'm Elijah Oliver, and we've been waiting for you to come. Waiting for me? Why? Because you're family, son. Your blood runs back to this valley just like ours does, and because you're the only one with the authority to help us. Help you how? What do you want? John Cable spoke up from the crowd. We want to come home, Benjamin. Really come home, not just these shadow visits we've been making. But there's something stopping us, something that needs to be set right. I don't understand. You are home. You're here in the valley. Elijah Oliver shook his head. We're trapped between worlds, son. When they made us leave in 1944, they didn't just take our homes. They broke a sacred bond between our families in this land. That break has to be healed before we can rest. An elderly woman pushed forward. I recognized her from a photograph as Rebecca Cable, John's mother. They're planning to build something on our family cemetery, she said, her voice full of pain. A big visitor center right on top of where our babies are buried. If that happens, we'll be lost forever. My blood went cold. I'd heard rumors about Park Service plans to expand the facilities in Cades Cove, but I didn't know they were considering the cemetery area. When? I asked. Construction starts next month, John Cable said. They're going to move the graves to a new cemetery outside the valley. But Benjamin, you can't move a cemetery without Kent. Moving the souls too. If they dig up our family bones and take them away from the land where we lived and loved and raised our children, we'll never find peace. I looked around at all the faces staring at me with hope and desperation. What can I do? I'm just a park ranger. I don't have any power to stop construction projects. You have more power than you know, Elijah Oliver said. You're one of us, and you're one of them. You can speak for the living and the dead. And there's something else. Your great-great-grandfather made a promise before he died. A promise that his family would always protect this valley and the people in it. What kind of promise? Rebecca Cable answered. He promised that if anything ever threatened to destroy the spiritual heart of this place, his bloodline would stand guard. You're the last of his line still connected to this land, Benjamin. The promise passes to you. I felt like the weight of 150 years was settling on my shoulders. But what exactly am I supposed to do? Stop them from moving the cemetery, John Cable said. Find a way to make them understand that some things are more important than bigger parking lots and fancy visitor centers. Make them see that this place is still alive, still sacred, still home to people who never really left. And if I can't? The spirits all looked at each other, and I saw fear in their faces. Then we fade away forever, Becky Cable whispered. And this valley becomes just another tourist attraction instead of the living, breathing community it's always been. Elijah Oliver stepped closer to me. But there's hope, son. If you can stop the desecration and help us heal the break that was made when we were forced to leave, we can find peace. We can become guardians of this place instead of prisoners in it. We can help you protect the valley and teach visitors about what it really means to love the land. I stood there in that cemetery, surrounded by the spirits of my ancestors and their neighbors, feeling the weight of their hopes and fears. These weren't evil ghosts that's trying to hurt people. They were families trying to come home, trying to protect the place they'd loved more than their own lives. All right, I said finally. I'll try. I don't know how, but I'll try to stop them from moving the cemetery. The spirits smiled, and one by one they started to fade away. But just before John Cable disappeared, he said, "Thank you, Benjamin. And remember, you're not alone in this. We'll help you any way we can." Then they were gone, and I was standing alone in the cemetery with the morning sun burning away the last of the fog. I had less than a month to save a graveyard, stop a construction project, and somehow heal a wound that had been bleeding for over 20 years. I just hoped the spirits were right about me not being alone in this fight. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my life. I spent every day researching, making phone calls, and writing letters to anyone who might have the power to stop the cemetery project. I contacted historians, archaeologists, Cherokee tribal leaders, and even some politicians in Nashville and Washington. But everywhere I turned, I got the same answer. The project was already approved, the contracts were signed, and construction would begin right on schedule. The spirits kept appearing to me, always with the same desperate question, "Any luck, Benjamin?" And every time, I had to tell them no. Then, 3 days before the construction crews were supposed to arrive, something happened that changed everything. I was working late at the ranger station when my phone rang. It was a reporter from the Knoxville News-Sentinel who'd heard rumors about unusual activity in Cades Cove. "Ranger Coalburner," she said, "I've been getting calls from tourists who say they've seen people in period clothing working around the historic buildings. They're saying the place is haunted. Do you have any comment?" I thought, and about all the official denials I was supposed to give, all the rational explanations for what people were seeing. Then I thought about John Cable's sad eyes and Rebecca Cable's desperate plea to save her family's graves. "Ma'am," I said, "would you be interested in spending a night in Cades Cove with me? I think you should see for yourself what people are talking about." 2 nights later, she met me at the visitor center just before sunset. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was one of those tough, no-nonsense reporters who didn't believe in anything she couldn't see with her own eyes. That was about to change. We walked out into the valley just as the last light was fading from the sky. I'd told the spirits what I was planning, and they'd promised to show themselves if it would help save the cemetery. They kept their word. As the darkness settled over the valley, the lights began to come on in the cabins. Sarah saw them too. Her eyes got wide and she started taking pictures with her camera. Then the sounds started, Families talking, children playing, someone playing a fiddle in the distance. "This is impossible," she whispered. "There's no electricity in those buildings." "Keep watching," I told her. We walked to the cable cabin, where John was sitting on the porch, rocking in a chair and smoking a pipe. When Sarah raised her camera, he looked right at her and nodded, like he was giving her permission to take his picture. "Can you see him?" I asked. I can see something, like a shadow that looks like a person, but my camera's picking up more than my eyes are." We spent 2 hours walking through the valley, and everywhere we went, we found families going about their evening routines. Sarah took dozens of pictures, and in every one, you could see the spirits clearly, cooking, talking, reading, playing music, living the lives they'd been forced to leave behind. At the cemetery, we met Elijah Oliver again. This time he was solid enough that Sarah could see him clearly. "Ma'am," he said to her, tipping his hat politely, "I understand you're here to tell our story. We'd be much obliged if you'd help folks understand what this place means to us." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, then found her voice. You're really here? You're really talking to me?" "Yes, ma'am. My name is Elijah Oliver, and I lived in this valley for 63 years before the government made me leave. This here cemetery holds 4 generations of my family, and they're planning to dig them all up and move them away from home. We can't let that happen." "Why? What would happen if they moved the graves?" "Our spirits would be lost forever, separated from the land that gives us strength. This valley would become just another empty tourist spot instead of the living community it's always been. The stories would die, the memories would fade, and all the love that's been poured into this soil for 150 years would be gone." Sarah was writing furiously in her notebook. "What do you want people to know?" "That some places are sacred," Rebecca Cable said, appearing beside Elijah. "That you can't just bulldoze over a cemetery because you want more parking spaces. That the people who lived and died here deserve to have their resting places protected." Sarah's story ran on the front page 3 days later, complete with photographs that clearly showed the spirits of Cades Cove. The headline read, "Families Fight to Save Sacred Cemetery in Smoky Mountains." Within hours, the story was picked up by newspapers and TV stations across the country. People started calling the Park Service, demanding that the cemetery be left alone. Historians and archaeologists, who had been ignored when they raised concerns about the project, suddenly found their voices being heard. The Cherokee Nation issued a statement supporting the protection of the cemetery, calling it a sacred place where the spirits of the ancestors continue to watch over the land they loved. 3 days after the story broke, I got a call from the regional director of the National Park Service. "Colburner," he said, "I'm officially suspending the Cades Cove Visitor Center construction project pending a full review of the cultural and historical significance of the cemetery site." That night, I went back to the valley to share the news. The spirits were waiting for me at the cemetery, and when I told them what had happened, you could feel the joy and relief washing over the place like a warm wind. "You did it, Benjamin," John Cable said, shaking my hand with fingers that felt almost solid. "You saved our home." "We're not done yet," I told them. "They're only reviewing the project, not canceling it. We need to make sure they understand that this place needs permanent protection." Elijah Oliver smiled. "Oh, we'll make sure they understand. We've got plenty of time now to show them what this valley really means." Over the next few months, the spirits of Cades Cove became the most effective tour guides the park had ever had. They appeared to visitors regularly, always polite and respectful, sharing stories about their lives and the history of the valley. Sarah Mitchell's newspaper ran follow-up stories, and soon Cades Cove became famous as the place where you could actually meet the people who'd lived there. Tourism increased, but it was a different kind of tourism. People came to learn about the families, to hear their stories, to understand what it meant to love a place so much that even death couldn't make you leave it. The Park Service officially designated the entire valley as a cultural heritage site, with special protection for all the cemeteries and historic buildings. The visitor center was built outside the valley, where it wouldn't disturb any sacred sites. As for me, I kept my job as a park ranger, But now I had some very special assistants. The spirits helped me give tours, shared historical details that weren't in any book, and made sure that every visitor left with a deeper understanding of what Cades Covey really was. John Cable became my closest friend among the spirits. He told me once that they weren't ghosts anymore. They were guardians, protectors of the place they'd never really left. "You kept your promise, Benjamin," he said. "Your great-great-grandfather would be proud. You helped us find our way home." I still work in Cades Cove today, 20 years later. The spirits are still there, still sharing their stories, still taking care of the land they love. And every morning when I drive through that valley, I can see smoke rising from the chimneys and hear the sounds of families going about their daily lives. Because some places are more than just tourist attractions. Some places are home to people who loved them so much that even death couldn't make them leave. And sometimes, my name is Rebecca Ashworth, but everyone calls me Becca. I work as a forest ranger, which means I watch over big forests to keep them safe. I've been doing this job for 12 years now, and I thought I knew everything about forests and the animals that live in them. But I was wrong. In 1987, something happened to me in the mountains of West Virginia that changed everything I believed about the world. Most people won't believe my story, but I'm telling it anyway because it's true. I used to work at Yellowstone National Park, the famous one with all the geysers. But that spring, I moved to a place called Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I had my reasons for leaving Yellowstone. Some things happened there that I didn't want to think about anymore. My new job was pretty simple. I worked alone in a tall tower on top of the highest mountain in West Virginia. The mountain was called Spruce Knob, and it was 4,863 feet high. My job was to watch for forest fires and keep track of the weather and animals. The tower was made of steel and stood 60 feet tall. At the top was a small room with big windows all around so I could see in every direction. On clear days, I could see for 50 miles. It was lonely up there, but I liked it that way. I studied birds in college, and West Virginia was a great place to watch them. Every fall, millions of birds fly south through these mountains, following paths their families have used for thousands of years. It's like a highway in the sky. But that September, something was very wrong. The birds weren't acting normal. They were flying south way too early, weeks before they should have started. And they were flying at night, which most birds never do. Their flight paths looked crazy, like they were running away from something scary instead of just going where they were supposed to go. Then there were the storms, strange storms that it made the radio crackle with noise and the lights in the sky dance in colors that shouldn't be there. My compass started spinning around like it was broken, but I knew it wasn't. The old stories from the Cherokee people talked about spirits in these mountains. They called one of them Thunderbird's dark brother. I always thought those were just made-up stories to scare people. I believed in science and facts, not ghost stories. I should have listened to those old stories. The first week of September was quiet except for the weird bird behavior. I made my regular reports to the main office, checked my equipment, and tried to figure out why the animals were acting so strange. Then things got much worse. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning. I was talking on the radio with my boss when a pilot named Jake Morrison came on the emergency channel. His voice sounded scared and confused. "This is Jake in the small plane Cherokee 77 Alpha. I need help. There's something flying next to me at 8,000 feet, but it's not answering my radio calls and it's not on any of the airplane channels." I grabbed my binoculars and looked up at the sky. I could see Jake's little white airplane like a tiny dot against the blue sky. And there was something else flying right next to it, something dark that matched every turn Jake made. "Jake, can you tell me what the thing looks like?" I asked into my radio. "That's the weird part, Becca. It doesn't look like any airplane I've ever seen. The wings are too big, and they're moving up and down." My stomach felt cold. "Moving up and down?" "Yeah, like a bird flapping its wings. But it's huge. The wings must be 15 or 20 feet across. and it looks like it has legs hanging down underneath. Through my binoculars, I watched the dark shape suddenly shoot straight up into the clouds, moving faster than any bird or plane could go. Jake's plane kept flying normally, but I could hear he was really shaken up. That was just the beginning. Over the next week, 3 different small airplanes had their engines stop working near my mountain. All 3 pilots said they saw a big, winged shape right before their engines quit. All of them managed to land safely, but now the airplane people were asking lots of questions. Then I found something that made my blood turn cold. I climbed down from my tower one morning to check my equipment, and I saw them, dozens of dead birds lying on the ground around the base of the tower. There were sparrows, little singing birds, and even some big hawks. They weren't hurt or sick-looking. They were just dead, and someone or something had arranged them in perfect circles. I collected some of the birds and sent them to a lab to find out what killed them. The results came back saying there was nothing wrong with them. No poison, no disease, no reason they should be dead. They had just stopped living. That's when my radio equipment started acting really weird. It began with a low humming sound, like a big machine running somewhere far away. But the sound was constant and seemed to come from nearby. I checked all my equipment thinking something was broken, but everything looked fine. Late that night, while I was writing in my logbook, the humming sound suddenly got louder and changed pitch. The windows in my tower started shaking, and I felt pressure in my chest like I was standing too close to a huge speaker. I reached for my radio to call for help, but the moment I touched it, everything went quiet. No static, no voices, nothing. I tried my backup radio. Dead. My satellite phone showed no signal. For the first time in 12 years of being a ranger, I couldn't talk to anyone in the outside world. That's when I saw the eyes. Red lights in the darkness beyond where my spotlight could reach. 2 of them, glowing like hot coals about 8 feet off the ground. They weren't moving like animal eyes usually do. They just hung there in the black night, watching me. I grabbed it to my strongest flashlight and pointed it toward the lights. The beam barely reached them, but what I saw in that cone of light made my hands shake so bad I almost dropped the flashlight. It was a shape, tall and wrong-looking, with wings that seemed to suck up light instead of reflecting it back, and those eyes burning with their own red fire. I blinked, and it was gone, but I knew it was still out there, watching. After that first night, the scary things happened more and more often. I started having dreams that felt too real to be dreams. I would see disasters that hadn't happened yet. Always the same thing, a big dam breaking apart, water rushing down into a town in the valley, people screaming as their houses got swept away. I'd wake up sweating and scared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing something that was really going to happen. My radio equipment kept breaking, but only at night. Between sunset and sunrise, I couldn't talk to anyone. During the day, everything worked fine. I started to be afraid when it got dark. On Thursday night, things got much worse. I was trying to call the ranger station when my whole tower started shaking. It wasn't wind. This was different. It shook in a rhythm, like giant wings beating against the air. The steel beams groaned and creaked, and I watched the thick cables that held up the tower start to vibrate like guitar strings. Then I heard a sound I'll never forget. It was like nothing in nature, a low, deep call that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The kind of sound you feel in your bones instead of hearing with your ears. It made my teeth hurt and my vision get blurry. I stumbled to the window and looked up. Something huge blocked out the stars, a winged shadow against the night sky. As I watched, it came down toward my tower platform, moving as gracefully as a bird despite being enormous. The platform shook when it landed. Through the thin walls of my cabin, I could hear it moving around outside. Heavy footsteps, the sound of claws scraping on metal, the rustle of huge wings folding up. And underneath all that, the constant deep humming that made my heart beat fast. I pressed myself against the far wall, afraid to move or even breathe. My camera was sitting on the desk just 3 feet away, but I couldn't make myself reach for it. Something told me that trying to take a picture would be a very bad idea. The creature walked around my cabin once, then twice. I could see its shadow moving past the windows and hear the metal bending under its weight. Then it stopped right in front of my main window. Nothing happened for a long time. Then slowly, two red eyes appeared in the glass. They were huge, each one the size of my fist, and they glowed with a fire that hurt to look at. But I couldn't look away. There was something smart behind those eyes, old and alien, studying me like I was a bug in a jar. The moment our eyes met, pictures flooded into my mind. The dam again, but clearer this time. I could see cracks spreading through the concrete like spider webs. I could feel the water pressure building up behind the failing wall. I saw the town below, Millbrook, about 30 miles away. Families sleeping in their beds, kids dreaming, all of them not knowing that death was coming toward them in the dark. And I saw the date. October 15th, just 2 weeks away. The vision lasted only a few seconds, but when it ended, I was on my knees with blood coming out of my nose. The creature was gone, but deep scratches had been carved into the steel window frame, claw marks that went through metal like it was soft clay. I knew then that this wasn't just some weird new kind of bird. This was something else entirely. Something that could see the future, mess with electronics, and put thoughts into people's heads. Something that was trying to warn me about something terrible. The next morning, I hiked down to my truck and drove straight to the dam at Millbrook. I told them I was doing a safety check, which was a lie, but my ranger badge got me inside. What I found scared me more than any monster. The dam was in terrible shape. Tiny cracks spread through the concrete like a broken windshield, and the machines that were supposed to watch for problems were old and broken. When I asked when someone last checked if the dam was safe, the manager just shrugged. "No money for that," he said. "We just look at it with our eyes. It's been standing for 40 years. It'll probably last another 40. I wanted to tell him about my visions, about the creature on the mountain that could see the future. Instead, I asked to see their paperwork and started taking pictures of everything. That night back in my tower, the Mothman came back. This time, I was ready. I'd moved my chair to face the window and had paper and pencil ready. If this thing was trying to tell me something, I was going to listen. It landed on my platform just after midnight, and again, those huge red eyes appeared at my window. But this time, instead of showing me the disaster, it showed me how to stop it. I saw myself making phone calls, writing reports, demanding that someone do something. I saw engineers coming to the dam, their faces serious as they looked at their instruments. I saw people leaving the town, traffic jams as everyone got to safety. But I also saw them alive and safe. The creature was showing me how to save them. But there was a price. In the vision, I saw myself losing my job, people saying I was crazy. I saw officials ignoring me and saying I was unstable from being alone too long. I saw the truth buried in government files so people wouldn't panic. The Mothman was asking me to give up everything to save people who would never know I saved them. I looked into those burning red eyes and nodded yes. For the next 2 days, I didn't sleep. I wrote down every craze. Bach in the dam, looked through old records, and built a case that the dam was about to break. I called everyone I knew, even my old college professor. The trick was making it look like I'd found the problems through normal work. I couldn't mention the visions or talk about supernatural warnings. I had to make them believe I was just being really, really good at my job. On October 14th, exactly 1 day before the date in my vision, a team of engineers finally came to look at the dam. What they found made them order everyone in Millbrook Valley to leave immediately. The dam broke at 3:17 in the morning on October 15th, exactly like I'd seen in my vision. But instead of a sleeping town, the water rushed through empty streets and abandoned buildings. Everyone was safe. The official report said I had found serious problems during a routine safety check. I got an award for being thorough and caring about public safety. Nobody ever asked how I'd known to look so carefully at a dam that wasn't even part of my job. The Mothman came to see me one last time, 3 nights after the dam broke. I was packing my things, getting ready to move to a new job. My choice, not theirs. I needed to get away from Spruce Knob and figure out what all this meant for the rest of my life. The creature landed on my platform as gently as a regular bird, even though it was enormous. But this time, it didn't come to the window. It just stood there in the moonlight, letting me see it clearly for the first time. It was beautiful in a scary way, 8 feet tall, with a body like a person but covered in dark fur or feathers. Its wings reached almost to the ground when folded, but it was the eyes that held me, old, sad, and patient. In that final moment, I understood. The Mothman wasn't a monster or a bringer of bad luck. It was a guardian, watching over these mountains and the people who lived here. It could see the future, but it couldn't change things by itself. It needed human helpers, people willing to act on impossible knowledge and accept what happened afterward. For just a moment, I felt connected to something huge and timeless, a network of watchers and protectors that stretched across the world. I wasn't the first person the Mothman had talked to, and I wouldn't be the last. Then it spread its wings and flew into the sky, disappearing into the stars. That was 10 years ago. I work at Yellowstone again now, back where I started. But sometimes, late at night when the radio fills with static and the air feels electric, I get calls. Not on the phone, in my head. Flashes of the future, warnings about disasters that haven't happened yet. A wildfire that will jump across 3 fire breaks. A rock slide that will block the only way out of a campground. A flash flood in a canyon where school kids are hiking. I've learned to trust these visions. My bosses think I'm really good at predicting dangerous weather. They don't ask how I know when to tell people to evacuate or change hiking trails. They just trust me. I keep detailed notes about everything. The visions, the warnings, the lives saved. Someday, maybe I'll find another ranger ready to hear the truth. Someone who won't think I'm crazy when I tell them about the creatures that watch over us from the shadows. Until then, I wait and watch and listen. Because somewhere out there, the Mothman is still flying through the night, still seeing the disasters that haven't happened yet, still looking for people willing to act on faith and save strangers who will never know their names. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep their guardians. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very unlucky, the guardians find you. My name is Rebecca Ashworth, and this is what really happened on Spruce Knob in 1987. I know you probably won't believe me. Most people don't. But the next time you hear about a disaster that was avoided at the last minute, about people who got evacuated just in time, about a range, or who somehow knew exactly where danger would strike, remember this story. Remember that some warnings come from places science can't explain, delivered by messengers that shouldn't exist, and be grateful that they do.